The courtroom was silent except for the sound of the gavel striking the wood. Clint Eastwood stood at the defense table, his hands resting on the cold, polished surface, his weathered face betraying little of the storm brewing inside. He had never imagined he'd be back here, facing the very institution he once walked away from. But here he was, and it felt like fate had a twisted sense of humor. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge's voice boomed, breaking the silence and drawing every eye in the room. "I have to admit, I didn't expect to see you in a courtroom again. I thought your days of legal arguments ended when you hung up your law degree for a film career." Clint's brow furrowed, but he kept his composure. His former career as an actor was legendary, and his departure from law school was often a subject of mockery. Yet, what the judge didn't understand was that Clint wasn't the man who had walked out of those law school doors decades ago. Clint Eastwood had evolved into something more than an actor. The man standing here now was not a fading star, he was someone who had lived a lifetime, fought battles in the real world, and learned more than the textbooks could ever teach. But today, he wasn't there to debate his past. He was there to defend his client, a man wrongfully accused, a case that needed a legal mind with precision, not one clouded by judgment and mockery. The judge, a sharp and cynical figure, leaned back in his chair and chuckled. "I wonder, Mr. Eastwood, if you'll be able to keep up with the demands of this courtroom. After all, you've spent more time in front of the camera than behind a desk with law books." Clint's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. He had been the subject of ridicule before, especially in his early years, but none of that had ever stopped him. He had faced challenges far tougher than the judge sitting in front of him now. With a calm that betrayed no trace of doubt, Clint spoke up. "I may not have finished law school, but I know what it takes to win a case. And I'm here to do just that." The judge smirked, tapping his fingers on the bench, obviously enjoying the power he held over the actor-turned-defender. "We'll see about that, Mr. Eastwood. We'll see." The courtroom filled with a low murmur. This wasn't just a case of criminal law, it was a battle of egos. A veteran judge who had seen it all versus a Hollywood icon, trying to prove that there was more to him than his fame. But Clint wasn't just here to prove anything about himself, he was here because someone's life hung in the balance. Clint turned to his client, a young man named Andrew Collins, whose face was etched with both fear and hope. Andrew had been charged with a crime he didn't commit, a crime that could ruin his life. His entire future depended on Clint's ability to navigate the labyrinth of the legal system, and Clint couldn't let him down. His mind raced back to the moment he was approached about this case. At first, Clint had been hesitant. He had long since put aside any dreams of practicing law. His life was different now, filled with the memories of his long career in Hollywood. But when Andrew's lawyer, a former colleague, came to him with the details, Clint felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a spark of purpose. The case wasn't easy. It was complex, filled with legal technicalities, evidence that didn't add up, and a prosecutor eager to win at any cost. But Clint had always loved a challenge. And as much as the judge mocked him, Clint knew something the judge didn't. He was not the same man who had left law school all those years ago. "You'll need more than charm to win this case," the judge continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But I'll be watching. Just don't expect any special treatment because of your celebrity status. This is real law, Mr. Eastwood." Clint nodded slowly, meeting the judge's gaze. "I wouldn't dream of asking for special treatment. I'm here to do my job." The room quieted as the judge cleared his throat. The trial was about to begin, and the clock was ticking. The stakes were high. But Clint wasn't intimidated. He had faced much worse in his career. Fame, fortune, and even failure, those things didn't faze him. What mattered now was this case, this moment, and the young man sitting beside him. The judge gave a sharp nod, signaling the beginning of the trial. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as the prosecutor rose to make the opening statement. Clint remained motionless, his eyes focused, his thoughts sharp. He had already begun to formulate his strategy, his legal acumen kicking into gear. This was no ordinary trial. This was Clint Eastwood's chance to prove that he was more than just a man who had once walked away from a law degree. This was his opportunity to show that his legal mind was just as formidable as his acting skills. "Remember," Clint whispered to Andrew, just loud enough for him to hear, "we're not here to fight the judge. We're here to fight for the truth." Andrew nodded, his eyes filled with hope. He believed in Clint, even if the judge and everyone else had their doubts. Clint's unwavering confidence was enough to inspire belief in others. And that was all that mattered. As the prosecutor launched into his opening statement, Clint leaned forward, listening intently. Every word, every sentence could be a clue, a piece of the puzzle. Clint wasn't just there to defend, he was there to dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece. The tension in the room was palpable. The judge, despite his earlier mockery, was now focused, his eyes scanning Clint as if waiting for him to slip up. But Clint knew that no one would be able to take him by surprise. He had been in tougher spots, and he had always come out on top. As the prosecutor finished his opening statement, Clint stood up, his presence commanding attention. The courtroom grew silent once more. Clint Eastwood had made his entrance, not as an actor, but as a lawyer, ready to take on the world. "Your Honor," Clint began, his voice steady, "I'm not here to impress you. I'm here to win this case. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?" As Clint Eastwood sat back down at the defense table, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. It wasn't just the eyes of the courtroom on him or the judge's mocking attitude. It was the deep, personal history he carried with him, the history that had led him to this point. A history that many didn't know, but one that shaped every decision he had ever made. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. The judge had made his point loud and clear: Clint Eastwood, the actor, was not suited to practice law. But the truth was far more complicated than that. Clint's path to this courtroom had been anything but straightforward. Years ago, back when he was still a young man with dreams of something greater, he had enrolled in law school. It was an ambitious choice, a natural progression after years of working odd jobs and trying to figure out what he truly wanted in life. Law seemed like a noble pursuit, one that could offer both intellectual challenge and the opportunity to make a difference. But life, as it often does, threw him a curveball. Clint had always been driven by an intense desire to succeed, to prove his worth. Yet, when the opportunity to audition for a film role came up, it felt like destiny calling. The decision to leave law school wasn't easy. His parents had supported his legal ambitions, and his professors had seen potential in him. But the allure of the big screen, the excitement of performing, of telling stories that resonated with millions, pulled him away. It wasn't that he didn't care about the law, it was simply that he had discovered something else that he loved, something that made him feel alive in a way that law never had. But now, after decades of fame, wealth, and recognition in Hollywood, Clint felt a pull back to the world he had left behind. He had spent his career portraying tough, no-nonsense characters on screen, but deep down, he had always kept a love for the law burning. And this case, this young man named Andrew, had ignited that spark again. Sitting in the courtroom, Clint's mind flashed back to the moments that had led him here. After years of being at the top of his craft, Clint had begun to feel an emptiness, a sense that something was missing. He had achieved all his goals, but there was one thing he couldn't shake, his desire to return to something more meaningful. Clint had spent years quietly mentoring young filmmakers, helping them find their way in an industry he knew all too well. But his true return to the legal world had come when a friend, an old law school colleague, had reached out to him. The case seemed simple enough on the surface, a young man accused of a crime he didn't commit. The legal system had failed him, and the evidence against him was shaky at best. Andrew Collins, the young man in question, reminded Clint of someone from his past, a time when he had seen the same passion for justice that had driven him. When he had heard Andrew's story, Clint knew he had to step in. He wasn't ready to turn his back on something he had once loved. And so, against all odds, Clint decided to return to the one place he had left behind so many years ago. But as he prepared for the case, Clint's doubts crept in. He wasn't sure he was the man he once was. The legal system had changed. Laws had evolved, and the world he was about to step back into wasn't the same one he had left behind. Still, there was something about Andrew's case that felt different. Clint couldn't ignore the feeling that this was his chance to finally prove to himself, and to the world, that he was still capable of making a difference. He had known the cost of fame. He had lived with the consequences of being thrust into the public eye at such a young age. His fame had often overshadowed his true identity, and many had questioned whether he had what it took to succeed outside of Hollywood. But the truth was, Clint had never stopped thinking about law. Even after all the years of acting, directing, and producing, the principles of justice, fairness, and truth had never left him. His mind flashed back to a time when he had been a struggling young actor. He had faced failure, rejection, and countless nights questioning his future. It was in those dark moments that Clint had learned the most valuable lesson of all, resilience. He had picked himself up again and again, no matter how many times he was knocked down. Now, in this courtroom, facing the sneering judge and the hostile prosecutor, Clint felt that same drive surge within him. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It wasn't just about winning or losing. Clint had come to realize that his return to law was about redemption. It was about showing the world, and himself, that he was more than just a screen icon. He was someone who could stand up for what was right, someone who could make a difference. Andrew Collins sat beside him, a nervous young man who had no idea the depths of Clint's past, but Clint saw in him a reflection of his younger self, a person fighting against odds, trying to find their place in a world that seemed to work against them. Clint understood what it was like to feel like you didn't belong. But he also knew the power of persistence, of pushing forward even when the world doubted you. Looking around the courtroom, Clint couldn't help but feel a rush of adrenaline. He wasn't just an actor anymore. He wasn't just a washed-up celebrity trying to relive his glory days. He was a man on a mission. And the mission was clear, to give Andrew Collins a fighting chance. The judge's mocking remarks still echoed in his mind, but Clint blocked them out. He had heard worse. He had faced worse. He knew what was at stake, and it wasn't just Andrew's future, it was his own. This case was his chance to reclaim something he had left behind long ago. And he wasn't about to let it slip away. As the prosecutor began speaking again, Clint's resolve hardened. He wasn't there to prove anything to anyone but himself. His skills, honed over years of life experience, were sharper than ever. The courtroom was his stage now, and it was time to show the world what Clint Eastwood could really do. No longer just a man of action on the screen, Clint was about to become a man of action in the court of law. The courtroom's tension grew thicker as Clint Eastwood settled into his chair, his focus now fully on the task at hand. He could feel the weight of the judge's skepticism, the prosecutor's challenge, and the uncertainty from his own client, Andrew Collins. The case had only just begun, and yet Clint could already sense the rising conflict. Andrew, the young man sitting beside him, looked like he was about to crumble. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, his knuckles pale from the pressure. He had trusted Clint when he walked into the room, hoping that this legendary figure from Hollywood could somehow perform a miracle. But now, with every sarcastic glance the judge sent their way, Andrew's doubt was becoming clear. Clint placed a reassuring hand on Andrew's shoulder, offering the only comfort he could provide in this suffocating atmosphere. "Stay calm," Clint whispered. "We're just getting started." Andrew nodded, but his anxiety was palpable. Clint couldn't blame him. He too had been nervous, but his nerves came from a place of knowing how much was at stake, not just for Andrew, but for himself. The road ahead would be long and treacherous, filled with legal obstacles that Clint hadn't faced in decades. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man named Richard Donnelly, rose to speak. His presence in the courtroom was almost as commanding as Clint's, though his demeanor was cold and calculating. Donnelly had spent his career in the courtroom, building a reputation as someone who always knew how to secure a win. Today, he would be fighting for the conviction of Andrew Collins, and Clint knew that every word he uttered would be designed to put the pressure on. "Your Honor," Donnelly began, his voice dripping with confidence, "we are here today because Andrew Collins is a criminal. The evidence is clear. His fingerprints were found at the scene of the crime, and witnesses have identified him as the person who committed the assault. It's a simple case, and it's one that we will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt." The prosecutor paused, looking over at Clint with a smug smile. "No amount of Hollywood charisma or aging bravado can change the facts. We will prove that Andrew Collins is guilty, and justice will be served." Clint didn't flinch. He had seen prosecutors like Donnelly before, cocky, self-assured, believing that they could steamroll anyone who dared challenge them. But Clint wasn't like the others. He wasn't here to play by the usual rules. He wasn't going to let Donnelly or the judge intimidate him. When Donnelly finished speaking, Clint stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on him. He could already hear the murmur of disbelief from the audience. The once great Clint Eastwood, the man who had walked away from law, was now stepping into the arena once again. "Your Honor," Clint began, his voice steady and filled with quiet confidence, "I've spent most of my life making movies, playing characters who fight for what's right. But this isn't a movie, and I'm not here to impress anyone with my past. I'm here to represent a man who has been wrongly accused. A man who doesn't deserve to have his life ruined by a case built on circumstantial evidence." Clint paused, allowing his words to settle in the air. The judge, who had been dismissive of him earlier, leaned forward, intrigued by his calmness. Even the prosecutor, who had been so certain, was momentarily thrown off guard. "This isn't about winning or losing," Clint continued, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "This is about uncovering the truth. And the truth is, the evidence against Mr. Collins is flimsy at best. The fingerprints that were allegedly found at the scene, they don't prove anything. The witnesses who supposedly identified him will show they could be wrong. I won't rest until we've examined every piece of evidence thoroughly." The room fell into a stunned silence. Clint Eastwood was no longer the aging actor trying to prove a point. He had transformed into something entirely different, a man who had a mission. And that mission was to protect his client at all costs. The judge, who had initially mocked Clint, shifted in his seat. "Mr. Eastwood," he said with a slight edge to his voice, "you may think you can dismantle the case with a few words, but the truth is that the evidence speaks for itself. This isn't a Hollywood script where you can create a happy ending out of thin air. This is real life, and the facts are clear." Clint met the judge's gaze without hesitation. "I'm not here to create a story, Your Honor. I'm here to find the truth, and I'll follow it wherever it leads, no matter how inconvenient it might be." The judge's expression hardened, but Clint could see the flicker of respect in his eyes. The courtroom had been thrown off balance, and Clint was just getting started. Donnelly, eager to regain control, snapped back into action. "This is a waste of time, Mr. Eastwood," he said sharply. "We've all seen the evidence. There's no need to waste the court's time with your rhetoric." But Clint wasn't deterred. He had faced down far more dangerous opponents in his life, both on screen and off. He had been in high-stakes situations before, where every word mattered, where the smallest mistake could cost everything. But today, he wasn't just fighting for his own pride. He was fighting for a young man's future. Clint looked down at the file in front of him, his fingers brushing over the case details, as if the weight of the evidence was speaking to him. There were holes, gaps in the story that the prosecution hadn't accounted for. Clint could feel the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "Your Honor, I request that we take a closer look at the evidence," Clint said, his voice commanding. I'm not here to waste time. I'm here to make sure justice is served. The judge narrowed his eyes but didn't respond immediately. He had clearly underestimated Clint at first, but now he was beginning to see that the former actor wasn't just playing a role. Clint Eastwood was playing for keeps. Andrew, who had been sitting quietly by Clint's side, now looked up at him with a mix of awe and relief. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. Clint's calm and calculated approach had already shifted the dynamic in the room, but the real work was about to begin. The prosecutor and the judge weren't the only obstacles Clint had to face. The real battle was about to start, one that would test not just Clint's skills as a lawyer, but his resilience and determination to bring the truth to light. The courtroom felt like a battlefield. The tension was palpable, every exchange between Clint and the prosecution carrying an undercurrent of a high-stakes game. It was clear to everyone present that Clint wasn't simply here to defend Andrew Collins, he was here to disrupt the system that had so easily dismissed him. As Clint sat back down after his impassioned speech, the judge briefly glanced at him over the rim of his glasses. There was a flicker of something in the judge's eyes, something that resembled a challenge. Clint wasn't just here to make a point, he was here to win. The prosecutor, Richard Donnelly, had underestimated Clint's determination and skill. He had been dismissive, assuming that Clint would fumble in his return to the courtroom. But Clint knew something the prosecutor didn't, he understood the rules of the game, and he knew how to bend them to his advantage. The case against Andrew had initially seemed like an open-and-shut situation. The evidence was compelling on the surface, fingerprints, eyewitness testimony, and a clear connection between Andrew and the crime scene. But Clint knew that sometimes, the most obvious facts were the ones that hid the truth. Andrew, sitting quietly next to Clint, was still processing the whirlwind of events. He had never imagined his life would lead him here. A young man with hopes and dreams, now facing a future in prison for a crime he didn't commit. It was overwhelming, to say the least. But Clint's presence beside him was a steadying force. Clint had taken Andrew's case not out of some sense of duty, but because he believed in the truth, he believed in Andrew's innocence. As the courtroom settled, Clint signaled for the bailiff to bring the case files to him. He had been studying them carefully, but now he needed to review them with a focused, critical eye. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered across various documents, witness statements, security footage, police reports. Clint needed to find the flaws, the holes, the discrepancies. And he needed to find them fast. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge called, his tone sharper now, "I expect you to be more specific in your arguments. Your last statement was nothing but generalities. If you're going to challenge the evidence, I expect you to back it up with solid facts." Clint didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly stood up again, his movements deliberate, controlled. He was playing the long game now, and every move had to count. "Your Honor," Clint began, his voice even, "you're right. It's time to back up my statements with the facts. Let's start with the fingerprint evidence." The prosecutor, Richard Donnelly, shifted in his seat. Clint had already made a subtle shift in the courtroom dynamics. He wasn't just challenging the facts, he was forcing Donnelly to prove his case. According to the police report, Clint continued, Andrew Collins' fingerprints were found at the crime scene. But here's the thing, those prints were on a door handle, not a weapon. The prosecution wants you to believe that because Andrew's fingerprints were found, he's guilty. But fingerprints alone don't prove a thing. Clint paused, letting his words sink in. The judge was leaning forward, and even the prosecutor was trying to maintain a neutral expression, though his eyes betrayed him. Clint had struck a nerve. What the prosecution has failed to mention, Clint continued, is that those fingerprints were not found in a context that suggests guilt. There's no blood, no weapon, no other physical evidence tying Andrew to the crime. The door handle he allegedly touched could have been brushed against by anyone. It's not definitive evidence of anything. Clint's eyes scanned the room, settling on the jury. He could see the flickers of doubt begin to form in their minds. Some had leaned forward, others exchanged glances. They weren't convinced, not yet, but Clint could see he was making progress. "Let's move on to the eyewitness testimony," Clint said, shifting his focus to the next part of the case. "We have witnesses who claim they saw Andrew at the scene, but what they didn't mention is that the lighting was poor, the location was crowded, and the circumstances were chaotic. Are these reliable witnesses? Are their memories infallible? It's easy to mistake someone in a moment of panic, especially when they're only given a fleeting glimpse of the person." Clint turned to Andrew, who was sitting still, his face a mixture of hope and disbelief. Clint had his back, and that was the most important thing. "I've seen countless people misidentified in similar situations," Clint continued, his voice cutting through the room with a quiet authority. "Eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. And the fact that these witnesses are so certain about what they saw doesn't change the fact that their perceptions could be wrong." For a moment, there was a hush in the room. Clint had just launched his attack on one of the most critical pieces of the prosecution's case. The judge was still watching Clint closely, his sharp gaze calculating, but Clint could see the flicker of uncertainty in the judge's eyes now. He was beginning to appreciate the method behind Clint's words. Clint turned back to the prosecutor, who was now visibly irritated. "I'm not trying to discredit your witnesses, Mr. Donnelly," Clint said, his tone cool. "I'm simply asking the court to consider the possibility that their testimony isn't as reliable as it seems. You have a case built on assumptions, and I'm here to challenge those assumptions." Donnelly rose to his feet, trying to regain control of the room. "Mr. Eastwood, you're grasping at straws. Your arguments are flimsy. The evidence is clear, and no amount of rhetoric can change that." Clint met his gaze with a calm, unwavering stare. "The truth doesn't need my rhetoric, Mr. Donnelly. It speaks for itself. You may have your evidence, but it's not enough to convict an innocent man." The judge's gavel came down sharply. "Order in the court," he commanded. "Mr. Eastwood, I expect you to stick to the facts and avoid theatrical statements. This is not a performance." Clint, ever the seasoned professional, nodded respectfully. "Of course, Your Honor," he said, his voice a touch quieter, but still filled with confidence. "But sometimes, it takes a little drama to shake the truth loose." The tension in the room reached a boiling point as Clint continued to dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece. With every argument, he pulled the rug out from under Donnelly's confidence. But Clint wasn't satisfied. He wasn't done. This was just the beginning. As the day wore on, Clint could feel the shift in the courtroom. What had started as a trial he was unlikely to win was slowly morphing into a battle he had a chance of winning. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and Clint knew that if he kept pushing, kept questioning every assumption, he could expose the cracks in the prosecution's case. Andrew Collins was still sitting next to Clint, but he wasn't trembling anymore. His hands were no longer white-knuckled from fear. For the first time in the entire trial, Andrew allowed himself to believe in Clint, and believe in the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they could win this. Clint Eastwood wasn't just playing the game, he was changing the rules. And the courtroom was about to find out that this was no ordinary defense. The tension in the courtroom was at an all-time high. Clint Eastwood had spent days poking holes in the prosecution's case, and now the final moments of the trial were approaching. The witnesses had testified, the evidence had been examined, and Clint had delivered a series of arguments that had left even the most skeptical members of the jury questioning the validity of the accusations against Andrew Collins. But Clint knew that the battle wasn't won yet. The judge, though less dismissive now, still maintained a firm skepticism. The prosecutor, Richard Donnelly, remained unshaken in his belief that he would emerge victorious. And Andrew, sitting beside Clint, was more anxious than ever. The young man had hoped, prayed, and dared to believe, but as the trial neared its end, doubt began to creep in again. The courtroom was still. The air was thick with anticipation as the final arguments loomed. It was Clint's turn to speak again. He rose from his chair slowly, his movements deliberate as he adjusted his tie. The judge looked over at him, his eyes sharp and waiting. The prosecutor stood by, arms folded, trying to appear confident despite the cracks Clint had exposed in his case. "Your Honor," Clint began, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of emotion. "We've heard the prosecution's case. We've seen the evidence they've presented. But there is something crucial they've overlooked, a truth that I believe this court cannot ignore." Clint paused for a moment, letting his words linger in the air. He wasn't just delivering an argument now. He was about to do something that would leave everyone in the room stunned. The judge raised an eyebrow, signaling Clint to continue. "Go on, Mr. Eastwood." Clint turned his gaze toward the jury, meeting the eyes of each juror one by one. His tone softened, becoming more personal, almost intimate. "I've spent a lot of time in courtrooms, but not like this. I'm not a professional lawyer. I'm not someone who knows all the legalese by heart. What I know is this: Andrew Collins doesn't belong in this trial. He doesn't belong here with a life that's been upended by a mistake." The audience stirred, and Clint could feel the change in the air. The prosecution's smug confidence had wavered slightly, and the judge's stern expression had softened. Clint wasn't just arguing legal points anymore, he was speaking directly to their hearts. "Andrew Collins is a young man, full of promise and potential," Clint continued, his voice growing more impassioned. "But like all of us, he's made mistakes. We all have. But the mistake here is that he's being accused of something he didn't do. The real mistake is that we've allowed the pieces of this case to fit together in a way that's convenient, not true." The room fell into a deep, uncomfortable silence. Clint's words hung heavily in the air. "Earlier in this trial," Clint continued, "I showed you the holes in the prosecution's evidence. We've debunked their theories, their assumptions. We've pointed out the discrepancies, the falsehoods. But there's something else we need to look at, something that no one has yet acknowledged." Clint's eyes locked onto the prosecutor, Richard Donnelly. "There is a witness whose testimony has been overlooked. A witness who could change everything. A witness who saw the real perpetrator at the scene of the crime." The courtroom shifted. The murmurs began to spread, and everyone turned to look at Clint with renewed curiosity. The prosecutor's confident stance began to falter, but Clint wasn't done. Clint pulled a small, unassuming file from his briefcase and placed it on the table. He glanced up at the judge. This witness was never called to testify. The prosecution chose to ignore them, perhaps because their testimony didn't fit the narrative they wanted to tell. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Eastwood, what are you suggesting?" Clint's voice dropped to a near whisper. "I'm suggesting that the entire case against Andrew Collins is built on a lie that was reinforced by a single witness who was too easily dismissed." The prosecutor, now visibly nervous, snapped back, "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Eastwood is speculating. There is no evidence to support his claims." Clint turned to face the judge, his gaze unwavering. "Your Honor, I'm not speculating. I'm presenting the truth that the prosecution has chosen to ignore. I'm asking for a fair trial, where every piece of evidence is considered. And I'm asking for Andrew Collins to be given a chance to clear his name." The judge hesitated, his hand resting on the gavel. There was a long pause in the room as the weight of Clint's words settled in. The audience was holding their breath, unsure of how the judge would respond. Clint could see it in their eyes, the same disbelief he had seen when he first walked into this courtroom. But now, the judge seemed to be considering something. Finally, the judge spoke. "Mr. Eastwood, you're asking for a lot. But I will grant you the opportunity to call this witness to the stand. However, I warn you, this better not be a last-minute maneuver designed to prolong this trial." Clint's eyes flashed with a hint of triumph, though his expression remained calm. "Thank you, Your Honor." The prosecutor was visibly rattled now, but Clint could see the fear in Donnelly's eyes. He knew that if this witness was allowed to testify, the entire case could unravel. But Clint wasn't finished yet. He was about to do something that no one had expected, not even the judge. As the courtroom prepared for the witness to be called, Clint turned to Andrew, who was watching him intently, his eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. Clint gave him a brief nod, a silent promise that he wasn't alone. "Clint," Andrew whispered, barely able to speak. "Are you sure about this? Are you sure this witness can help?" Clint placed a firm hand on Andrew's shoulder. "We'll find out in just a moment. Stay strong, Andrew. We're almost there." The doors to the courtroom opened, and the witness was brought in. Everyone turned to look, but Clint's focus never wavered. He knew the truth was about to be revealed. And when it came, it would change everything. The courtroom fell into an intense silence as the doors swung open, and the witness was led into the room. Clint Eastwood didn't even look up. He knew exactly who it was, and he knew what kind of impact this person would have on the trial. As the witness stepped forward, a wave of uncertainty swept through the room. The jury leaned forward in their seats, all eyes trained on the individual walking toward the stand. The prosecutor, Richard Donnelly, narrowed his eyes, trying to gauge what Clint was up to. The witness was a woman, middle-aged, with soft features and a calm demeanor. She looked out of place in the high-stakes drama unfolding in the courtroom. But Clint knew she had the key to everything. She wasn't just any random person, she was the one who had seen something the others hadn't. "Please state your name for the record," the judge said, his voice firm. The woman cleared her throat before responding, her voice steady but a little nervous. "Lena Hawkins." Clint, standing with confidence, approached the stand. He turned to the jury before speaking, ensuring that every pair of eyes was focused on him. "Lena," Clint began, "can you tell the court what you witnessed on the night of the crime?" Lena hesitated for a brief moment. She seemed to gather her thoughts, and when she spoke, her voice was calm but undeniably clear. "I was walking home from work," Lena began. "It was late, and I was taking my usual route. I live just a few blocks from where the incident occurred. I didn't see the actual crime happen, but I saw someone leave the scene shortly after." The room held its breath. This wasn't the first time someone had mentioned seeing a figure near the crime scene, but it was the first time anyone had come forward with actual details. Clint leaned forward slightly. "And can you describe the person you saw?" Lena's gaze shifted around the room before locking eyes with Clint. "Yes," she said. "The person was tall, with dark hair and wearing a long coat. But what stood out to me was the fact that they were limping. They were walking away from the building, and they seemed to be in a hurry." Clint took a step back, his mind racing. This was the crucial detail they had been missing, something that completely contradicted the earlier descriptions given by the other witnesses. This individual didn't match Andrew's appearance at all. "Did you recognize this person?" Clint asked, a glimmer of hope in his voice. Lena shook her head. "No, I didn't recognize them. I've never seen them before in my life." Clint turned toward the jury, allowing the weight of Lena's testimony to sink in. This was the turning point. He could feel the shift in the room. He could see the faces of the jurors beginning to change, their skepticism giving way to doubt. "Thank you, Ms. Hawkins," Clint said. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit this testimony as evidence. This witness's statement directly contradicts the prosecution's theory that Andrew Collins was the only one at the scene." The judge nodded, his expression unreadable. "Noted. You may proceed, Mr. Eastwood." Clint turned back to the witness. "Ms. Hawkins," he said, his voice steady but filled with intensity, "how certain are you that the person you saw was not Andrew Collins?" Lena took a deep breath before answering, her gaze fixed firmly on Clint. "I'm certain. Andrew Collins doesn't match the person I saw. The man I saw was taller, and he had a different build. Plus, Andrew doesn't have a limp. Clint's heart raced. This was it. The key to the entire defense had just been handed to him on a silver platter. He took a moment to let Lena's words sink in. He could feel the eyes of the jury on him. He could almost hear their thoughts. This wasn't the image of the suspect they had in their minds. And Andrew Collins, an innocent man, had just been given a lifeline. "Thank you, Miss Hawkins," Clint said, his voice smooth and calm. "I have no further questions." Lena stepped down from the stand, and the room seemed to exhale in unison. The prosecutor, Richard Donnelly, was now visibly rattled. His composure had cracked, and Clint could see the anxiety in his eyes as he realized how dangerous Lena's testimony was to his case. "Objection, Your Honor." Donnelly suddenly barked. "This testimony is irrelevant. This witness cannot possibly prove that Andrew Collins wasn't involved. There's no way to link this person to the actual crime." The judge raised a hand, signaling for calm. "Sustained, Mr. Donnelly. But you may now cross-examine the witness if you wish." Donnelly stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Ms. Hawkins," he said, his tone sharp, "are you absolutely sure that the person you saw was not Andrew Collins? You've only seen him briefly, and you've admitted you don't know him." Lena stood her ground, her voice unwavering. "I'm sure. I've never met Andrew Collins before, and the man I saw didn't resemble him in any way." Clint watched as Donnelly floundered. It was clear that he was losing ground, and the strength of Lena's testimony had caught him off guard. He glanced at the jury, whose faces had become more attentive, more receptive. The doubt Clint had hoped for was finally taking hold. "Thank you, Miss Hawkins," Clint said, turning back to the witness, his voice filled with gratitude. "You've been very helpful." As Lena left the witness stand, Clint couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. This was the break they had been waiting for. This was the moment that would change everything. Andrew's innocence had just been made clearer than ever. The jury was no longer just listening to a defense attorney. They were witnessing a master at work. Clint had exposed the cracks in the prosecution's case, and now the pieces were falling into place. The real criminal was still out there, and it wasn't Andrew Collins. The room was alive with murmurs, but Clint wasn't done yet. He turned to face the jury once again, his voice calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I ask you to consider everything you've heard in this trial. And I ask you to consider one simple question: can you convict an innocent man based on assumptions, on evidence that doesn't add up, on a case built on shaky ground?" He paused, his eyes scanning the faces of the jurors. "Andrew Collins deserves justice. And it's up to you to make sure he gets it." The courtroom buzzed with energy as the witness stepped down, and for the first time in days, Clint Eastwood could feel the shift in momentum. Lena Hawkins' testimony had shattered the prosecution's narrative, and the air in the room had thickened with doubt. The jury, once skeptical of Clint's defense, now seemed to be questioning everything they'd heard up until this point. But Clint knew that this wasn't the moment to rest on his laurels. He needed to strike while the iron was hot, to press the advantage and finish the job. As the witness left the stand, Clint turned to the judge. "Your Honor," Clint began, his voice low but filled with an undeniable authority, "I would like to call my next witness for cross-examination." The prosecutor, Richard Donnelly, had been visibly shaken by Lena's testimony, but he straightened up quickly, attempting to regain his composure. His eyes narrowed as he looked at Clint, sensing the shift in the courtroom. He knew what was coming next, the cross-examination. "Mr. Eastwood," Donnelly said, his voice tight, "this witness is irrelevant. You've already made your point. I think it's time we move on to closing arguments." Clint didn't flinch. He was used to intimidation tactics. The prosecutor's attempt to brush aside Lena's testimony only confirmed that Donnelly knew he was losing. Clint turned toward the jury, his expression steely. "I respectfully disagree, Your Honor," Clint replied, glancing at the judge. This cross-examination is crucial. We've only scratched the surface of what needs to be addressed. I would like to cross-examine Mr. Donnelly's witness. The judge hesitated for a moment, glancing between Clint and Donnelly. After a beat, he nodded curtly. Very well. Proceed, Mr. Eastwood, the judge said. Clint's pulse quickened as he stood up from his seat and walked to the witness stand. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, the silent anticipation from the jury hanging thick in the air. Donnelly had called forth a key witness, someone who had been pivotal to the prosecution's case. Clint knew this witness had been used to strengthen their argument, but he also knew that the truth had a way of coming to the surface when it was exposed. Mr. Miller, Clint said as he approached the stand. You've been called here as a witness for the prosecution, correct? A man in his 40s, wearing a neatly pressed suit, nodded from the witness stand. Yes, that's correct. Clint continued, his voice measured. And you've testified that you saw Andrew Collins at the scene of the crime, am I right? That's correct, Mr. Miller replied, his voice shaky, as though the intensity of the moment was beginning to get to him. Clint raised an eyebrow, walking slowly toward the witness box. Interesting. Because in your earlier testimony, you mentioned that you saw Mr. Collins only for a few seconds, in a dimly lit area, correct? Mr. Miller shifted uncomfortably. That's right. It was very dark. I didn't get a good look at his face, but I'm sure it was him. Clint nodded thoughtfully, letting the words hang in the air for a moment. He turned toward the jury, pacing slightly. So, to be clear, you saw someone in the dark, in an area where details were hard to make out, and you've testified that this person was Andrew Collins. He paused for dramatic effect before facing Mr. Miller directly. But did you ever ask yourself if you could have been wrong? If, perhaps, your identification was made under duress, in the heat of the moment, and with minimal evidence? Mr. Miller seemed to freeze, caught off guard by Clint's direct approach. Clint continued, you say you saw Andrew Collins for only a few seconds. You say the lighting was poor, and you couldn't even get a clear view of his face. But you're absolutely sure it was him? Clint's voice dropped to a near whisper. Are you? A bead of sweat formed on Mr. Miller's forehead. He opened his mouth but seemed to struggle for words. Clint was closing in. Mr. Miller, Clint said, his tone shifting to one of quiet authority, you've made this identification based on mere suspicion, haven't you? You didn't actually see Andrew Collins commit this crime. You saw someone, yes. But was it really him? Or was it a case of misidentification? The courtroom was silent, every eye focused on the witness. The tension was palpable, and Clint could feel the power of his words sinking in. He was about to press the advantage even further. Mr. Miller, Clint continued, his voice growing firmer, in fact, we both know that you've been coached on your testimony, don't we? The room seemed to collectively hold its breath. Mr. Miller's face drained of color as Clint's words hit their mark. You've been instructed on how to identify Andrew Collins, and that's exactly what you've done. You've provided the prosecution with a story that fits their narrative. But that doesn't make it the truth, does it? Clint's gaze locked onto Mr. Miller's, his stare unwavering. Mr. Miller began to stammer, his composure crumbling under Clint's unrelenting pressure. I didn't. Clint raised a hand, cutting him off. You didn't expect to be cross-examined so thoroughly, did you? You didn't anticipate someone pointing out the glaring holes in your testimony. The fact that you've been unreliable from the beginning is now glaringly clear. The prosecutor, Donnelly, stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Eastwood is badgering the witness. The judge looked over at Donnelly and then back at Clint. Sustained. Mr. Eastwood, please refrain from pushing the witness too far. Let's focus on the facts. Clint didn't back down. Of course, Your Honor, he said, his voice calm and collected as he gave Mr. Miller one last, piercing look. You may step down, Mr. Miller. The witness hurriedly left the stand, clearly shaken, as Clint returned to his seat. He glanced at the jury, who were now exchanging glances with one another. He could see the doubt that had crept into their minds. The prosecutor's key witness had just been torn apart, and Clint had done it with surgical precision. "Your Honor," Clint said, turning to the judge with a cool expression. "I have no further questions for this witness." Donnelly, now visibly upset, sat down with a huff, his face red with frustration. He had no rebuttal, no comeback for what Clint had just done. The jury, on the other hand, looked more and more like they were starting to come to a new conclusion. The prosecution's case was crumbling under the weight of Clint's genius. Clint leaned back in his chair, his mind already focused on the next steps. The case was shifting in his favor with each passing moment, and he was prepared to finish what he had started. The tension in the courtroom had reached its peak. Clint Eastwood's cross-examination had done the impossible. He had torn apart the credibility of the prosecution's most crucial witness, and the jury was on the edge of their seats. Clint knew he had the momentum now, but there was one more thing to do. One more revelation that would turn the case completely around. Clint glanced at the clock. The trial had been dragging on for days, but he could feel the turning tide. Richard Donnelly, the prosecutor, was sitting rigidly at his desk, trying to look confident, though the cracks in his armor were growing more visible by the minute. The judge, his face grim and focused, glanced down at his notes. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "You may now present your next piece of evidence." Clint stood and gave a slight nod, his fingers brushing over the papers in front of him. He had kept this evidence close to his chest, an ace in the hole, ready for the right moment. "I'd like to present an audio recording, Your Honor," Clint said, his voice smooth and steady. He motioned to his assistant, who swiftly approached with the evidence. The courtroom was quiet as everyone waited for Clint to speak again. "This is a recording from a phone call made the night of the crime. It's a conversation between a key witness and the defendant, Andrew Collins. And I believe it will answer some very important questions." A murmur rippled through the room, and Clint could see the surprise on the faces of the prosecution team. Donnelly's jaw clenched, but he made no move to object. Clint handed the recording over to the judge, who briefly listened before nodding. "We will now play the recording for the court." The room fell completely still as the sound of a phone call filled the space. The voice on the other end was unmistakable. It was Andrew Collins. The other voice belonged to a man Clint had not yet seen in court, a man whose voice had been eerily familiar, though no one had placed it. "Andrew," the man said, "you need to get out of there. The police are already on their way." Andrew's voice came through, distorted slightly but still clear. "I didn't do anything. I swear to you, I didn't do it. But I'm scared. I don't know who else is involved." The jury sat motionless, the gravity of the moment sinking in. The audio continued, with the man on the other end urging Andrew to stay calm, to avoid the police, and to meet him at a different location. "Who is this person?" Clint asked aloud, his voice cutting through the silence. "And why would they be giving Andrew advice, telling him to avoid the authorities if he were guilty of a crime?" The room went quiet. Donnelly's face had turned an unnatural shade of pale, and he was quickly scribbling notes. He shot Clint an angry glance but kept his mouth shut. The jury was no longer looking at Andrew as the perpetrator of the crime, they were listening to the words of someone who appeared to be aiding him in evading justice. "Who is this person, Mr. Donnelly?" Clint asked, his tone rising now, louder and more forceful. "If Andrew Collins is guilty, then who is the one telling him to avoid the police? What is their role in all of this?" Donnelly stood abruptly, trying to compose himself. "Objection, Your Honor," he shouted, his voice shaking slightly. "This recording is completely irrelevant and inadmissible. We don't know who the second voice belongs to, and this doesn't prove anything." The judge raised a hand, signaling for calm. "Sustained. Mr. Eastwood, I'll allow you to explore the recording further, but you need to stick to facts, not speculation. Clint nodded but refused to let go of the thread he was pulling. Your Honor, this is absolutely relevant. This recording shows that someone who is not Andrew Collins, is clearly involved. And it proves that Andrew's actions that night may have been a result of fear, not guilt. The jury was hanging on Clint's every word. The recording had changed the entire atmosphere in the room. It was no longer about Andrew's guilt or innocence, it was about the larger story that was still waiting to be uncovered. That recording, Clint said, pausing for effect, proves that Andrew Collins was trying to protect himself. It proves that he wasn't the one who committed the crime, because he was in the dark about the situation, just like the rest of us. Clint turned to Donnelly, his eyes narrowing with confidence. So tell us, Mr. Donnelly, what's your explanation for this? Why is Andrew trying to avoid the police if he was the one responsible? Why would he need protection if he's the criminal? Donnelly opened his mouth but seemed at a loss for words. He shot a glance toward the judge, but Clint wasn't finished yet. I'll tell you why, Clint continued, his voice growing steady and authoritative. Because Andrew Collins didn't commit the crime. He was manipulated. He was coerced. And whoever the person is on that phone call, they're the one who needs to be sitting where Andrew is right now, being questioned for their role in this. The tension in the room was palpable. The jury, who had once believed the case was as good as closed, was now questioning everything. Clint had taken their doubt and used it to open a door to a whole new theory, one that shifted the focus from Andrew to the real culprit, whoever they might be. Clint took a step back, letting his words settle in. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. He had just exposed something crucial that no one had seen coming. Your Honor, Clint said, his voice lowering to a calm, almost chilling level, I request that we shift the focus of this investigation immediately. The real criminal is still out there. And it's time we bring them to justice. The judge looked down, his brow furrowing in concentration. The jury exchanged looks, some nodding slightly, others in deep thought. Clint could feel the weight of the room shift as the scales of justice began to tilt in his favor. The prosecutor, for once, was speechless. He knew Clint had just delivered a devastating blow, and the walls of his case were starting to crumble. Mr. Eastwood, the judge finally said, his voice even, you've made a compelling argument. We'll reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. for further proceedings. The gavel slammed down, signaling the end of the day's proceedings. Clint stood tall, a quiet confidence in his eyes as he gathered his papers. The trial was far from over, but for the first time, Clint felt like he was truly in control. Clint Eastwood stood in the hallway outside the courtroom, his gaze fixed on the stack of documents in his hand. The day's proceedings had been a turning point, but he knew this wasn't over yet. He had successfully planted seeds of doubt, but there was still much work to be done. The prosecution had been on the defensive all day, their arguments crumbling under his cross-examination and the bombshell phone call recording. But Clint knew that every great defense needed its moment of truth, something that would not only seal the case but also expose the conspiracy that had been lurking beneath the surface. He flipped through the papers, his mind working over the new lead that had emerged from the investigation. It was one of those details that might have slipped through the cracks if he hadn't stayed on top of every piece of evidence. The more he looked at it, the more he was certain that this was the breakthrough he needed. Mr. Eastwood, a voice called out behind him. Clint turned to find Lena Hawkins, the key witness whose testimony had played a pivotal role in turning the trial around. She was standing at the end of the hallway, her expression filled with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. She had been instrumental in showing that Andrew Collins wasn't the criminal, but Clint knew that her involvement in this case went deeper than anyone realized. Lena, Clint said, offering her a slight smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm glad you caught up with me. She walked toward him, a concerned look on her face. I've been thinking a lot about what happened today, about what you uncovered. I'm just glad you're not giving up. But, are you sure you're not risking too much? The prosecution is pulling out all the stops. They're not going to back down just because of one recording. Clint nodded thoughtfully. They've got nothing left but smoke and mirrors. What they don't realize is that the real story hasn't even begun to unfold yet. Lena looked at him, uncertainty still clouding her features. What do you mean? Clint glanced down at the papers in his hand, his fingers tracing the edges. I've got a lead. A strong one. And I think it's going to change everything. Lena raised an eyebrow. A lead? From where? Clint leaned in, lowering his voice so no one else could overhear. I've been digging into the financial records of the people involved in this case. And I found something that ties one of the prosecution's key witnesses to the crime. Lena's eyes widened. Wait, one of the witnesses is involved. Who? Clint gave her a knowing look. I'm not saying yet, but trust me, it's big. This person is a link, and once we expose them, the whole case will collapse. Lena took a deep breath, clearly processing the gravity of Clint's words. So, what do we do now? Clint's eyes darkened with determination. We need to get to them first. If we let them slip away, they'll try to bury everything they know. We need to take control of this before it's too late. Just then, Clint's assistant, Sarah, appeared in the hallway, holding a file in her hand. She looked as though she had just come from the courthouse's research department, and her face was a mix of excitement and urgency. Mr. Eastwood, you need to see this, Sarah said, thrusting the file into his hands. Clint's fingers tightened around the file as he flipped it open. Inside was a series of documents, a mix of financial records, phone records, and a few notes from a private investigator Clint had hired to dig deeper into the people involved in the case. As he scanned through the pages, Clint's mind started to connect the dots. This is it, Clint muttered under his breath. He glanced up at Lena and Sarah. This document shows a series of payments from one of the prosecution's witnesses to a third party, someone with ties to a criminal syndicate. Lena's eyes widened. You're telling me one of the witnesses is being paid off? Not just paid off, Clint replied, his voice low with intensity. They're involved in something much bigger than anyone realized. The connection between the witness and this syndicate could explain everything, the motive behind framing Andrew, the way the prosecution's case has been handled, and why they've been so relentless in pushing for a conviction. Lena shook her head, disbelief crossing her face. But why didn't anyone see this before? How did they get away with it? That's the million-dollar question, Clint said, his tone grim. But now that we know, we have to expose it. We have to make sure this doesn't go any further. Clint looked up at Sarah. Get in touch with the investigator we hired. We need everything they have on this person, fast. If we can link them directly to the crime, it's game over for the prosecution. Sarah nodded quickly, her eyes bright with determination. Understood, Mr. Eastwood. I'll make sure we have all the information within the hour. As Sarah walked away, Clint turned back to Lena. This is it. We're on the verge of blowing the case wide open. Lena exhaled, her nerves clearly rattled but also filled with a sense of purpose. So what's the plan? Clint's expression became resolute. We keep the pressure on. We don't let up. Tomorrow, we present this new evidence to the court. And once we do, the prosecution won't know what hit them. The next day, the courtroom was filled with an air of anticipation as Clint walked in, his eyes scanning the room for the next opportunity. He was ready. Ready to dismantle the prosecution's case for good. As he took his seat, the judge called the proceedings to order. Mr. Eastwood, you may present your new evidence, the judge said, his voice stern but curious. Clint stood up slowly, his heart beating with purpose. This was the moment. He had known the prosecution's case was built on lies and manipulation, but now he was about to expose the entire scheme. Your Honor, Clint began, his voice calm but commanding, what we have here is not just evidence of a poorly conducted investigation, it's evidence of a conspiracy. A conspiracy that was meant to frame my client for a crime he did not commit. The room went silent. Clint held up the file with the financial records and documents he had just reviewed, letting them all see the connection between the prosecution's witness and the criminal syndicate. These documents show payments from our witness to a criminal syndicate involved in illegal activity, and their role in orchestrating the events of that night. This is the smoking gun that will not only prove Andrew Collins' innocence but expose the real criminals behind this whole ordeal. Donnelly stood up quickly, his face flushed with anger. Objection, Your Honor. This is pure speculation. We have no evidence of any such connection. Clint didn't flinch. I have all the evidence I need, Mr. Donnelly. And I'm not speculating. I'm showing you the truth. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he processed the information. This is significant, Mr. Eastwood, he said slowly. We'll need to review these documents thoroughly. Clint nodded, his gaze unwavering. I'm confident that once you do, the case will no longer be about my client's guilt. It will be about finding those who truly need to be held accountable. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, the air thick with anticipation. The revelation Clint Eastwood had dropped like a bombshell the day before still echoed in the minds of everyone present. The prosecution was reeling, trying desperately to regain control. Clint could feel the momentum shift further in his favor, but he also knew this was the most dangerous moment in the case. Every move now had to be calculated, and one wrong step could give the prosecution the chance to regain their footing. Clint had spent the night poring over the new evidence, cross-referencing financial records, phone logs, and witness statements. The evidence was damning, a series of payments made to the prosecution's key witness by an underground criminal syndicate that had been linked to organized crime. But the most shocking part of all. This syndicate had connections to several high-profile figures, including some whose names had never been mentioned in the trial before. These were individuals with power, influence, and the means to bury the truth. Clint stood in front of the courtroom, his expression calm but resolute. He could feel the weight of the room on his shoulders. He was standing on the edge of something massive, a revelation that could change the entire course of the trial. But it was a dangerous game. He had to tread carefully or risk the entire case falling apart. Mr. Eastwood, the judge called, interrupting his thoughts. You may proceed with your argument. Clint nodded and stepped forward, his voice steady as he addressed the court. Your Honor, esteemed members of the jury, what we've uncovered goes far beyond the case of Andrew Collins. This is not just about one man. This is about a network of corruption that has been hiding in plain sight, manipulating the system for their own benefit. The truth is, this case has been orchestrated from the very beginning by people who had an agenda far removed from justice. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Clint could see the shock on the faces of the jury, but he couldn't afford to let up. He had to keep pushing, keep unraveling the web of lies. Yesterday, I presented you with financial records that expose the connections between a key prosecution witness and a criminal syndicate. But that's only the beginning. We've now uncovered ties to individuals who have used their influence to cover up the truth and ensure that the wrong person is held accountable. Clint paused, letting the gravity of his words settle in the room. He looked around, making eye contact with each member of the jury, one by one. The prosecution has told you a story about Andrew Collins, a man they want you to believe is guilty. But what they haven't told you is that this entire narrative has been constructed to protect those in power and point the finger at an innocent man. The prosecutor, Richard Donnelly, shot up from his seat, his face red with frustration. Objection, Your Honor, he shouted. This is pure conjecture. There is no basis for these wild accusations. The judge turned to Donnelly, his eyes narrowing. Mr. Donnelly, I will allow Mr. Eastwood to continue, but I suggest you refrain from interrupting him without cause. Clint didn't even flinch at the prosecutor's outburst. He was in control now. Let me show you just how deep this goes, Clint continued, his voice unwavering. He reached for the file containing the financial records and evidence he had meticulously gathered. What we have here is proof of multiple financial transactions between the key witness and a person named Samuel Cross, an individual with ties to an international criminal syndicate. And these payments aren't just small exchanges, they are substantial sums of money, moving in and out of offshore accounts, with one specific goal in mind: silencing anyone who might expose the truth. He held up a series of documents for the jury to see. These payments were made in the months leading up to the crime Andrew Collins is accused of. These documents are a trail of evidence that leads directly to the people who are pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The prosecutor, now visibly flustered, stood again. Your Honor, this is nothing more than a diversion. Mr. Eastwood is attempting to deflect from the real issue here. We are here to determine the guilt or innocence of Andrew Collins, not to investigate a criminal syndicate. Clint turned his gaze to Donnelly, his expression calm but piercing. The real issue, Mr. Donnelly, is that you've been trying to prosecute an innocent man while ignoring the larger conspiracy at play. And now, with this new evidence, we have a chance to uncover the truth. It's not just about Andrew Collins anymore. It's about making sure that those who are responsible for manipulating the system and framing him are held accountable. Clint turned to the judge, his voice low but commanding. Your Honor, I request that we issue subpoenas for the individuals named in these financial records. It's time we expose the full extent of this operation and the people behind it. The judge hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing the gravity of Clint's request. Finally, he spoke. I will grant your request, Mr. Eastwood. Subpoenas will be issued for the individuals named in the evidence you have provided. We will reconvene tomorrow to review the new developments. The gavel slammed down, signaling the end of the day's session. Clint stood tall, his mind already working ahead to the next phase of his strategy. He knew the fight wasn't over, but today he had taken a major step toward exposing the truth. He could feel the tide turning, and for the first time, he could see a way out of the mess the prosecution had created. Clint walked out of the courthouse, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the sidewalk. He was alone for the moment. Lena had to attend a meeting with her lawyer, and Sarah was gathering more information from the investigators. Clint needed this time to think, to regroup before tomorrow's critical hearing. As he walked through the bustling streets, Clint's mind raced with the implications of what had just happened. The prosecution was on the ropes. They had no idea what was coming next, and they were scrambling to recover. But Clint wasn't finished yet. He had one more trick up his sleeve, a final piece of the puzzle that would bring everything into focus. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from Lena, I've got something big. Meet me ASAP. Clint's heart skipped a beat. What could this be? He quickly typed a reply, on my way. As he headed toward the meeting spot, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of a cliff, and everything was about to come crashing down. The storm was coming, and he was ready to face it head-on. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The sun had just dipped below the horizon when Clint Eastwood met with Lena outside a small cafe on the edge of the city. The air was crisp, the streets bathed in the orange glow of the fading light. Clint walked briskly, the weight of the case pressing on him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that tonight might be the night that everything fell into place. Lena had reached out to him urgently, and Clint knew it wasn't just another lead, it was something bigger. Lena was already seated at a corner table, her eyes scanning the street as if she was trying to stay one step ahead of anyone who might be watching. When she saw Clint approach, she quickly stood up, pulling him into the quiet of the cafe with a glance that spoke volumes. Clint, I don't know how to explain this, she said, her voice low and tense. But I think I've found something that changes everything. Clint sat across from her, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. What is it? Lena placed a thick folder on the table, opening it to reveal a series of photos and documents. Clint's gaze flicked over the pages, noting the familiarity of some of the names and images. But there was one photo that caught his attention, a picture of Samuel Cross, the man who had been linked to the criminal syndicate, standing next to someone Clint hadn't expected to see. "Who is this?" Clint asked, his finger hovering over the image. Lena's voice was shaky as she spoke. "That's Charles Holt. He's a well-known figure in high society, an investor with major ties to the city's elite. I didn't know until now that he's been involved with Cross. But look at this." She slid a series of bank records toward Clint. His eyes skimmed the figures and transaction details. "Holt's been funneling money to Cross through several shell companies," she continued, "but the real kicker is that these payments aren't just business-related. They're linked to the very same criminal syndicate we've been trying to expose." Clint's heart skipped a beat. Charles Holt was a name Clint had heard in passing, but he never imagined someone of his stature would be involved in something so underhanded. Holt was a prominent investor, with close connections to several politicians and influential business leaders. If Holt's name was tied to the case, this would be the final piece of the puzzle that could bring everything crashing down. "We need to make this public," Clint said, his voice firm. "This is exactly what we need to turn the tide in court. Holt is connected to Cross, and this is the thread that ties everything together. Once we expose this, the prosecution's entire case falls apart." Lena hesitated, her eyes filled with concern. "But Clint, Holt is powerful. He's untouchable. If we go public with this, they'll come after us." Clint met her gaze, his expression resolute. "They already are. But we can't back down now. We've got the evidence, and we're going to make sure it sees the light of day." The following morning, Clint arrived at the courthouse with Lena and Sarah by his side. The tension in the air was palpable, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. The prosecution had clearly been rattled by the evidence Clint had presented, but they were far from giving up. Clint could sense their desperation as he entered the courtroom, but he had no intention of letting them recover. As Clint sat down, his eyes briefly met those of Richard Donnelly, the prosecutor. Donnelly looked harried, his usually composed demeanor now frazzled. He knew the walls were closing in. "Mr. Eastwood, you may proceed with your evidence," the judge announced, giving Clint the floor. Clint stood, his demeanor calm and focused as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, members of the jury, yesterday I introduced you to financial documents linking a key witness to a criminal syndicate. But I have new evidence that ties this case to something much larger than we ever anticipated." The room fell silent as Clint presented the bank records, photos of Samuel Cross and Charles Holt, and the undeniable evidence linking Holt's financial transactions to the criminal network that had been manipulating the case from behind the scenes. He let the weight of the document settle over the courtroom like a thick fog, the implications clear to everyone. "This," Clint continued, his voice steady but filled with intensity, "is not just a case of wrongful accusation. This is a case of corruption at the highest levels. These men, Samuel Cross, Charles Holt, and others who remain unnamed, have orchestrated a plot to frame Andrew Collins and cover their own tracks." He turned to the jury, his gaze unwavering. The money that was funneled through these shell companies was not for legitimate business ventures. It was to protect criminals, to silence anyone who might threaten their empire. And now, the truth is out in the open. The prosecution's side of the courtroom was in chaos. Donnelly stood up, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. "Objection, Your Honor. This is outrageous. These claims are baseless, and Mr. Eastwood is once again attempting to distract the jury with sensationalism." The judge, looking both annoyed and intrigued, waved Donnelly off. "Mr. Donnelly, I've heard enough of your objections. We will proceed." Clint took a deep breath, knowing this was the moment he had worked for, the moment where the tide had fully turned in his favor. "Your Honor, I request that a full investigation be launched into the connections between Charles Holt and Samuel Cross. These men are at the heart of a criminal conspiracy, and their involvement in this case is more than just incidental. They are the masterminds behind the plot to frame Andrew Collins. The room was silent. The prosecution had no rebuttal. They were out of arguments, and Clint had just dismantled their entire case with one move. As the court adjourned for the day, Clint, Lena, and Sarah walked down the courthouse steps, the weight of the moment sinking in. The case had taken an irreversible turn, and there was no going back now. Clint could feel the power shift, but he also knew that the real fight had only just begun. "This is huge," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've got them cornered now." Clint nodded, but there was no celebration in his demeanor. "We've only just exposed the tip of the iceberg. Holt and Cross are just the beginning. We need to make sure they can't escape this." Lena looked at Clint, her expression a mixture of admiration and wariness. "But Clint, they won't go down without a fight. Holt's not going to just sit back and let this happen. They'll try to destroy us." Clint's eyes darkened. "Let them. The truth is on our side, and as long as we keep pushing, they won't be able to hide forever." The tension in the courtroom was almost suffocating as the days wore on. Clint Eastwood had delivered blow after blow, each piece of evidence more damning than the last. The prosecution, once confident and poised, was now disorganized and on the defensive. Every time Richard Donnelly stood up to object, his voice quivered with a hint of desperation. It was becoming clear, Clint had them cornered. Lena had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, compiling the missing pieces of the puzzle. The investigation was more than just about clearing Andrew Collins, it had become a battle to expose the larger network of corruption that had been operating under everyone's nose. And Clint wasn't about to let the truth slip away. Today, however, was different. Today was the day Clint planned to strike the final blow. He knew that if he didn't move fast, the prosecution might find a way to discredit the evidence they had so carefully pieced together. He had to finish this, and finish it right. As Clint sat at his desk, scanning the documents one last time before the trial resumed, Lena entered the room, her eyes wide with urgency. "Clint," she said, breathless, "I've just gotten a tip. It's Holt. He's trying to run, he's leaving the country today." Clint's heart skipped a beat. "Where's he going?" "To a private jet at the airport. He's got the means and the connections to escape without a trace." Clint stood up, his face hardening with determination. "Not if I can help it. We need to expose him right now, before he has a chance to slip through our fingers." When Clint walked back into the courtroom, it felt as though the entire room had been holding its breath. The jury was already seated, and the murmurs that filled the space died down as Clint approached the podium. He could sense the desperation coming from the prosecution's side, their confidence shattered by the revelations Clint had laid out. The judge, Judge Lawrence Hayes, glanced at Clint, who had his folder in hand. "Mr. Eastwood, you may proceed." Clint stood tall, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "Your Honor, members of the jury, this case has gone far beyond the question of whether Andrew Collins is innocent or guilty. What we've uncovered is something much more sinister, a web of lies and corruption that reaches into the highest circles of power." He opened the folder, revealing new documents, photographs, flight records, and communications between Charles Holt and a shadowy figure known only as Victor. Clint let the silence linger for a moment before continuing. "Here, we have records showing that Charles Holt was in contact with an individual named Victor, who is known to be a key player in the criminal syndicate we've been investigating. Holt's actions in the past few days make it clear, he is trying to flee the country to avoid facing the consequences of his actions." Clint's voice cut through the room like a knife. "But we won't let him get away with it." The prosecution's side erupted in protest. Donnelly shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is just more baseless conjecture. There's no proof Holt is involved in any criminal activity." Clint didn't flinch. "You want proof, Mr. Donnelly?" I've got proof. Holt's private jet is booked for a flight to Switzerland, and I've already contacted the authorities. They're intercepting it as we speak. A murmur of disbelief spread through the courtroom, and the judge looked at Clint, his brow furrowed. Mr. Eastwood, I suggest you provide verification of these claims immediately. Clint didn't waste a second. He motioned for Lena, who handed over a fresh set of documents to the judge. They were printouts of the flight records, confirming Holt's flight schedule and his connection to the criminal syndicate. Clint also handed over a report from the local authorities confirming that they had intercepted the jet at the airport, preventing Holt from escaping. The room fell silent as the judge reviewed the documents. Clint's heart raced, but he kept his composure. This was the moment. This was the proof they needed to finish the job. Finally, Judge Hayes spoke. Mr. Eastwood, this evidence is significant. I will allow the authorities to conduct a full investigation into Charles Holt's involvement in this case. The court will reconvene once that investigation has concluded. Clint felt a surge of victory. He had done it. Holt, the mastermind behind the entire scheme, was no longer a shadow in the background, he was now at the center of everything. As the court session ended for the day, Clint found himself walking out of the courtroom with Lena and Sarah. The air outside felt different now, charged with a sense of impending change. The battle wasn't over, but Clint had taken a major step toward bringing everything into the light. This is it, Sarah said, a wide grin on her face. We've got them. They can't escape now. Clint didn't share her enthusiasm, at least, not yet. We've won today, but the fight isn't over. Holt won't go down without a fight. We still need to make sure the authorities follow through and that no one tries to sweep this under the rug. Lena, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. Clint, do you really think they'll go after Holt? He's one of the most powerful men in the city. They might be afraid to take him down. Clint's jaw tightened. Then it's up to us to make sure they have no choice. If we stand our ground, keep pushing, they'll have no other option but to act. Holt's time is up. They walked in silence for a moment before Clint spoke again. We've exposed the truth. Now we just need to make sure everyone knows it. No one can hide behind their power anymore. As the trio made their way to their car, Clint's mind was already on the next step of the plan. Holt might be cornered, but there were still pieces of the puzzle left to place. But today was a turning point. The final countdown had begun. The following morning, Clint arrived at his office earlier than usual. The storm had already begun to form on the horizon, and he knew that the battle was far from over. The exposure of Charles Holt's flight to Switzerland had shaken the foundation of the case, but Clint also knew that this wouldn't be enough to topple the corrupt empire that had orchestrated this entire mess. Lena had called him earlier with news of Holt's lawyer, who was already preparing a strategy to have him released on bail. Clint's stomach churned at the thought of Holt slipping away, but he wasn't about to let that happen. Not when they were so close. Clint paced back and forth in his office, his mind racing with strategies. He knew the authorities were under tremendous pressure to follow through, but with Holt's connections, there was always a chance that the system could be manipulated. The key was to keep pushing forward, stay one step ahead. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Lena walked in with a stack of new documents in hand, her face serious. Clint, we've got an issue. Holt's lawyer is trying to use his connections to discredit the evidence you presented in court. They're claiming that the documents you provided were fabricated. Clint stopped pacing and turned toward her, his face hardening. What do you mean, fabricated? They're trying to say that the flight records and the bank transactions we've shown the court were altered, that they don't hold up under scrutiny, she explained, her voice filled with frustration. They've got experts lined up to prove that we tampered with the evidence. Clint clenched his fists, but he didn't let the anger show. He had been through enough high-stakes battles to know that this was exactly the kind of move they would make. Holt had money and power, and with that came resources to destroy the truth. "We've got to stay ahead of them," Clint said, his voice low and determined. "If they're going to attack our evidence, then we'll need to make sure they can't poke any holes in it." Clint's mind worked quickly, coming up with a plan. "Get me in touch with the person who tracked down those flight records. I want to make sure everything's airtight. If they think they can undermine us with their so-called experts, we'll give them someone who's more credible." Lena nodded. "I'll make the call." "But Clint, if Holt gets released on bail, this whole thing could unravel." Clint's gaze hardened. "He won't get released. We won't let that happen." The next day, the courtroom felt more intense than ever. The prosecution was scrambling to recover from the loss of their star witness, Holt, who was now the center of attention. Clint had no doubt that they would pull out every trick in the book to protect him. But he wasn't about to let them get away with it. As Clint entered the courtroom, he saw Holt's lawyer, Jonathan Price, standing near the front, speaking with the judge. Price was a man who exuded power. His crisp suit and polished demeanor gave him the look of someone who was used to getting what he wanted. But Clint wasn't intimidated. The judge, Judge Hayes, called the room to order. "Mr. Eastwood, we are here today to address the motion to release Mr. Holt on bail. Mr. Price, you may present your case." Price stood and adjusted his tie before addressing the court. "Your Honor, my client, Charles Holt, has been falsely implicated in this case. The evidence presented by Mr. Eastwood has been discredited, and there is no reason to keep him in custody while the case continues. He has deep ties to the community, and we ask that he be granted bail pending further investigation." Clint could feel the eyes of the jury on him as he stood. The prosecution was pushing hard, trying to make it seem as though Holt was being wrongly accused. Clint had to act fast. This was the moment he needed to strike. "Your Honor," Clint began, his voice calm but forceful, "I'd like to remind the court that the evidence we've presented is not only credible, but also verifiable. Mr. Price can claim whatever he likes, but the truth remains the same. Charles Holt was involved in a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power." He glanced at the judge. "The documents we provided were not fabricated, and I have an expert witness ready to confirm their authenticity. Mr. Price may bring his experts forward, but we have an individual who can speak directly to the validity of these records." Judge Hayes raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Mr. Eastwood, do you have this expert present?" Clint nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. If I may call him to the stand." With a gesture from the judge, Clint turned toward the courtroom door, where a tall, distinguished man entered. The room fell silent as he walked to the witness stand. Clint's ace in the hole, a forensic analyst named Robert Sinclair, who had personally authenticated the flight records, financial transactions, and other key documents in the case. Sinclair was known for his integrity and impeccable reputation in the field. His presence alone was enough to cast doubt on Holt's lawyer's claim of fraudulent evidence. After swearing in Sinclair, Clint wasted no time. "Mr. Sinclair, can you please explain to the court how you verified the authenticity of the documents we submitted?" Sinclair's voice was steady as he spoke. "Yes, Mr. Eastwood. I personally reviewed all the evidence, including the flight records and the financial transactions. I conducted a forensic audit of the digital files, cross-referenced them with independent sources, and ensured there were no signs of tampering. The documents are legitimate." Price's face twisted with frustration as he stood to object. "Objection, Your Honor. This man is a hired expert with a clear bias toward the defense." Judge Hayes silenced him with a wave of his hand. "Mr. Price, we will hear the witness out." Clint turned back to Sinclair. "Thank you, Mr. Sinclair. Is there anything else you would like to add regarding the integrity of the documents?" Sinclair glanced at the jury before answering. "There is no question in my professional opinion, the documents are authentic. And the actions taken by Mr. Holt and others involved in this case are consistent with illegal activity." The courtroom was still. Holt's lawyer was visibly rattled, and Clint could feel the tide turning in his favor. This was the decisive moment. Holt's hopes of escaping justice were slipping away, and the prosecution had nowhere to turn. Outside the courtroom, Clint stood alone for a moment, his thoughts racing. He had won this round, but Holt wasn't done yet. The man was a powerful figure in the city, and Clint knew that he wouldn't go down without a fight. The wheels of justice were turning slowly, but Clint had no intention of letting them be derailed. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and when he answered, it was Lena's voice on the other end. "Clint, there's something you need to know. Holt's people are already trying to get to the judge. They're offering him a bribe to dismiss the charges." Clint's blood ran cold. He knew the stakes had just gotten even higher. "We'll deal with it," he said, his voice steady but tinged with anger. "I'm not going to let them buy their way out of this. We'll make sure everyone knows the truth." He ended the call, his resolve hardening. The storm was coming, but Clint Eastwood wasn't about to let the corrupt forces win. He would see this case through to the end, and make sure that justice was served, no matter the cost. The pressure in the courtroom was palpable. Clint Eastwood knew the war wasn't over, not by a long shot. Holt's defense team had been floundering, but there were darker forces at play that Clint hadn't anticipated. Holt's wealth, influence, and network of power extended far beyond what anyone had realized. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It had become a war for justice, and Clint was at the center of it all. The trial had moved into its final phase, but behind the scenes, Clint could feel the walls closing in. The judge's ruling on whether Holt would be granted bail still loomed. While they'd managed to halt his escape attempt, Holt's lawyer, Jonathan Price, was already formulating his next strategy. Price was playing a dangerous game, and Clint knew that every move from here on out had to be calculated with precision. Clint sat at his desk, looking over his notes. He wasn't just preparing for court anymore, he was preparing for a battle that went far beyond the courtroom. Holt's reach had already begun to extend, and Clint could sense that there were hands pulling strings in places that most people would never think to look. Lena walked into his office with a somber look on her face, her phone still in her hand. "Clint, we've got a problem," she said, her voice laced with concern. Clint looked up, his eyebrows furrowing. "What now?" "There's been a leak," Lena said. "I just got word from a source inside the courthouse. It looks like someone close to the judge has been feeding information to Holt's team. They've been tipped off about the evidence we're presenting, everything we've been working on. And that's not all." Clint felt a chill run through him. "Who's behind it?" Lena shook her head. "I don't know yet, but they're deep. Whoever it is, they've got access to everything. Holt's team already knows about Sinclair's testimony and the expert witness we've lined up. They're going to try to discredit everything before we even get a chance to present it." Clint's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a legal game anymore, it was personal. Someone was trying to sabotage their case from the inside, and Clint wasn't about to let that happen. "We can't let them get away with this," Clint muttered. "We need to find out who's pulling the strings and make sure the jury sees the truth. There's no turning back now." The following morning, Clint walked into the courtroom with his head held high. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation, but Clint could feel the tension building behind the scenes. Holt's team was regrouping, but Clint wasn't going to back down. He had come too far. Judge Hayes took his seat, the gavel striking the wood with a resounding crack. "The court will hear arguments regarding the motion to grant bail for Mr. Holt," he announced. Clint stood, his eyes locking with the judge's as he prepared to make his case. He had spent the night making sure the evidence was locked down, every fact cross-referenced and verified. But he couldn't shake the feeling that someone in the room might be working against him. "Your Honor," Clint began, his voice calm but firm, "we are requesting that Charles Holt be denied bail and remain in custody until the trial is concluded. As we have shown in previous days, Mr. Holt is connected to a far-reaching network of criminal activity. He is a flight risk, and releasing him would only give him the opportunity to escape justice. Price stood up, his face smooth but his voice betraying the edge of tension. Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Eastwood is once again making wild accusations without presenting any new evidence. My client is a respected member of the community with no prior criminal record. There is no reason to believe he is a flight risk. Clint glanced over at Holt, who sat smugly at the defense table, his confident expression masking the fear that had to be creeping under the surface. He knew Holt wouldn't give up without a fight, but Clint had come too far to let him win. We have the evidence, Clint said, his voice unwavering. And we have the truth on our side. Mr. Holt's connections run deep, he's been orchestrating this entire scheme from the shadows. He is not the man the prosecution is trying to paint him as. He is the mastermind, and we have the proof to back that up. The judge nodded. Mr. Eastwood, I will take your arguments into consideration. But I must caution you that the court is facing a serious backlog of cases. I expect a swift resolution. Clint stood firm, unshaken. Your Honor, I understand the need for expedience. But justice cannot be rushed. If Mr. Holt is allowed to leave this courtroom today, we risk losing everything we've worked for. As the judge deliberated, Clint caught a subtle movement out of the corner of his eye. Price was whispering something to Holt, his hand moving as if making an unspoken agreement. Clint's instincts screamed at him that something wasn't right. It was as if Price and Holt were preparing for their next move, one that Clint hadn't anticipated. They were calculating, and they were dangerous. Clint's mind raced. He needed to figure out who was behind the leak, and he needed to do it fast. Someone in the courthouse was feeding information to Holt's team, and Clint needed to figure out who before they made their move. After court adjourned for the day, Clint gathered his team in his office, his thoughts still on the unsettling feeling he had in his gut. There's someone inside, working against us, he said to Lena and Sarah, both of whom were already busy preparing for the next phase. We need to figure out who it is, and we need to do it quietly. If we move too fast, we risk alerting them. Lena nodded. I'll make some calls. I have a few sources who might be able to help. Sarah spoke up. We should focus on the courthouse staff. The leak's coming from somewhere in there, and it's likely someone who has access to sensitive information. Clint agreed. Start there. Let's make sure we don't miss anything. And I want to make sure the authorities are aware of what's going on. Holt's trying to play dirty, but we'll be ready for him. Just then, Clint's phone rang. It was Lena again. Clint, I think I've found something, she said. There's a name. One of the court clerks, Henry Williams. I'm hearing rumors that he's been in contact with Holt's people. I think he's the leak. Clint's heart skipped a beat. Where is he now? I'm on it, Lena said. I'll get more information as soon as I can. As the days passed, Clint kept his focus on the case, but in the back of his mind, he was already preparing for the storm that was brewing. Holt's network was pulling strings, and Clint knew that if he didn't act fast, they would find a way to escape justice. Lena continued to dig into the courthouse clerk, Henry Williams, who seemed to be at the center of the leak. Clint knew that uncovering the full extent of Williams' involvement could be the key to bringing down Holt's operation once and for all. But as always, time was of the essence. The storm was closing in. Clint had already fought through countless obstacles, and he wasn't about to let anyone derail his pursuit of justice now. Holt's empire might be vast, but Clint was prepared to dismantle it, piece by piece. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial continued to unfold. But Clint Eastwood's mind was far from the surface-level arguments. His focus was on Henry Williams, the courthouse clerk who was suspected of being the source of the leak. Every step he took from here would be critical. The stakes had escalated. Clint wasn't just fighting for justice anymore, he was fighting against a web of corruption that threatened to destroy everything. As Clint walked into his office, he was met by Lena, who wasted no time in handing him a file. Her face was tight with determination. "I've got more on Williams," she said, her voice low, as if to avoid drawing attention. "He's been living beyond his means for the past few years, expensive cars, lavish vacations, all on a clerk's salary. I've also been able to confirm that he's been meeting with one of Holt's associates, a guy named Mark Davenport." Clint took the file, flipping through the pages, his sharp eyes scanning each detail. "So Holt's been using Davenport as his intermediary. No surprise there. Davenport's been involved in more shady deals than I can count. But how does Williams fit into this?" Lena leaned in. "Williams has been leaking court documents to Davenport for months. And there's something else, Davenport has been paying him off, and not just in money. I'm hearing rumors that Williams has been promised a bigger role if Holt gets off. This goes deeper than just a couple of hush payments." Clint's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed felt like a punch to the gut. Holt's network was vast, almost impossible to navigate, but Clint wasn't one to back down from a challenge. "We need to move quickly," Clint said, his voice low with resolve. "If Williams is compromised, then everything he's touched, everything, could be contaminated. We can't let Holt use his influence to manipulate the system like this." Lena nodded, her fingers flying across the keyboard of her laptop as she pulled up information on Davenport. Clint knew that their next steps had to be precise. He couldn't afford any more missteps. As the trial continued, Clint's every move was being scrutinized. The pressure to win was suffocating. Holt's defense team had gone quiet for the moment, but Clint knew it was only a matter of time before they struck back, and when they did, they would pull no punches. Clint sat in the courtroom, watching Holt's smug face as his defense attorney, Jonathan Price, once again made a mockery of the evidence. The courtroom atmosphere was electric, and Clint could sense the pendulum swinging back toward Holt. It was then that he noticed something he couldn't explain at first. Price was looking at him, a gleam in his eyes, almost as if he was daring Clint to make a move. The air felt thick, charged with an unspoken challenge. Clint stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that Holt's defense team had a backup plan, they always did. But there was a moment of clarity as Clint's mind raced through their strategy. Holt wasn't just fighting to win the case, he was fighting for something bigger. The question now was, what was that something? Clint's thoughts were interrupted when the judge called for a recess. He needed a moment to clear his head, to reassess everything that had happened so far. Clint met with Lena and Sarah in a quiet corner of the courthouse. The tension in the air was thick, but Clint wasn't about to let it derail him. "Okay, here's what we do next," Clint began, his voice steady but filled with a quiet fury. "We need to get our hands on more evidence, specifically, the documents that Williams has been leaking. We need to prove that he's compromised. The moment we have that, we go public with it." Lena nodded. "I've got a contact who works at the courthouse, someone on the inside who might be able to get us the documents. But it's risky. If Williams catches wind of what we're doing, we could lose everything." "Risk is the name of the game," Clint said. "We're running out of time. Holt's team is already positioning themselves for their next attack. If we don't strike now, we might lose the upper hand." The next few hours were a blur of planning and maneuvering. Lena's contact, a courthouse employee with access to sensitive documents, had agreed to help them, but only under the condition that it be done quietly. They couldn't afford to alert Holt's team. The risk of being caught was high, but Clint was prepared to take it. He had come too far to back down now. As Clint paced back and forth in his office, he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He was about to make a move that could change the course of the trial, and potentially bring Holt down for good. But he had to move fast. The longer they waited, the more dangerous the game became. The next night, Clint, Lena, and Sarah met in a dimly lit parking garage beneath the courthouse. The air was heavy with anticipation as they waited for Lena's contact to arrive. Clint knew that time was running out, and every second counted. They had to get the documents and use them to expose Williams, and with any luck, Holt's entire operation. A few minutes later, a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness. It was a young man, no older than 25, with a nervous expression. He walked briskly toward them, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was following him. "Here," the man said, handing over a thick envelope. "Everything you need is in there. But be careful, Williams is paranoid. He's been keeping a close eye on everyone." Clint took the envelope, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside were several copies of court documents that had been leaked to Holt's team. They were critical pieces of evidence, the kind that could tip the balance in Clint's favor. But Clint knew that this was just the beginning. He couldn't afford to rest on his laurels just yet. "Thank you," Clint said, his voice low but filled with gratitude. "This means more than you know." The man nodded, his eyes darting nervously. "Just, don't let Williams find out it was me. I can't risk it." As the man disappeared into the night, Clint felt a surge of hope. They had the evidence. But now, it was time to expose the corruption for what it was. The next day, Clint walked into the courtroom with the envelope tucked safely inside his briefcase. He had everything he needed to destroy Williams' credibility, and, by extension, Holt's entire defense strategy. As the judge called the trial back into session, Clint stood tall. He was ready. The moment had arrived. "Your Honor," Clint said, his voice steady, "I have here the proof of a serious breach of trust. The evidence has been leaked from within this courthouse, and the source is none other than Court Clerk Henry Williams. We have copies of the documents he provided to Holt's defense team." The courtroom fell silent as Clint held up the envelope for everyone to see. Holt's face twisted in shock, and Price's jaw tightened. They had been blindsided. But Clint wasn't done yet. "I request that Mr. Williams be removed from his position immediately, and I demand an investigation into the full extent of his involvement with Holt's criminal network." The judge paused for a moment, his eyes flickering toward Holt's defense team. Clint knew this was the moment that would determine everything. The air in the courtroom felt like it was made of tension. Clint's fingers were gripping the edge of the table as he stood firm, the envelope of damning evidence still raised for the court to see. A mixture of shock and uncertainty spread through the room, and Clint could see the ripple effect. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, and even the judge seemed momentarily frozen, as though trying to grasp the full weight of Clint's accusation. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge finally said, his voice steady but edged with disbelief, "you are accusing a court official of such serious misconduct. Do you have the proper documentation to back this up?" Clint did not flinch. His experience had prepared him for moments like this, moments when the walls around him seemed to close in. He knew this was just another game, and it was one he was determined to win. "I do, Your Honor," Clint said, his voice clear and unwavering. He opened the envelope and presented the documents to the judge, letting him take a close look. Clint's eyes flickered briefly toward the defense table, where Holt's attorney, Jonathan Price, was scrambling to come up with some form of rebuttal. Clint knew it was only a matter of time before they tried to dismiss the evidence or claim it was falsified. "I request, Your Honor, that you suspend Mr. Williams immediately and initiate a full investigation. The integrity of this trial is at stake," Clint added. The judge nodded slowly, clearly processing the gravity of the situation. "I will grant your request for a suspension of Mr. Williams pending further investigation. However, I need to remind all parties that the integrity of the court must remain intact. This will be dealt with swiftly." Clint's heart beat in his chest, but he kept his face calm. The first hurdle had been cleared. But Holt wouldn't give up easily. Clint could already see the wheels turning in the defense team's heads. Holt's influence ran deep, and the evidence against Williams was only a single thread in a much larger web of corruption. Clint sat back down, his mind already working on his next move. He had exposed Williams, but now he had to capitalize on the opening. Holt would be scrambling to cover his tracks, and Clint would be right behind him, unraveling the conspiracy piece by piece. As the court took a brief recess, Clint stepped outside the courtroom to clear his head. The noise inside had been deafening, but now, in the quiet of the hallway, he could think more clearly. He leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath. The victory felt small in comparison to the war he was fighting. The walls of the courthouse still loomed over him, tall and oppressive. But then, someone approached him from behind, and Clint turned to find a familiar face. "It's not over, Clint," Sarah said quietly, standing next to him. Her voice was filled with both concern and resolve. Clint didn't speak immediately, allowing the moment to linger before he responded. "I know. But this is a start. We've exposed one of their key players, and now they'll have to scramble. I'm counting on the investigation to reveal more." Sarah gave him a tight smile. "That's not why I'm here. I have something else, something you won't like." Clint raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "I've been talking to some of the people who work under Holt. They're nervous. And there's one person, Mark Davenport, who's been acting strangely. He knows something big is coming, and he's starting to distance himself from Holt's inner circle." Clint's mind raced. Davenport had been Holt's shadow for years, pulling strings from the background. If he was starting to show signs of fear, then Clint was closer to uncovering the full extent of Holt's operation. "If we can get to Davenport," Clint said, "we might be able to crack this case wide open." Later that day, Clint arranged for a meeting with Davenport. It was a risky move, but it was one that could pay off. If they could get Davenport to cooperate, they could finally bring down Holt's empire. They met in a nondescript cafe on the outskirts of town. Davenport arrived in a dark suit, his expression guarded. He didn't sit immediately, opting to stand at the counter as though trying to decide if he was in the right place. His nervous energy was palpable, and Clint could see that Davenport was struggling with something, perhaps guilt, perhaps fear. "Mr. Davenport," Clint said, his voice even but laced with determination, "I know you've been involved with Holt for years. But things are unraveling fast, and you're in a position to help us expose him." Davenport shifted uneasily, his eyes flicking toward the door. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice shaky. Clint could sense the hesitation beneath the words. "You don't have to play dumb with me," Clint continued, leaning forward slightly. "I know you're connected to Holt's operation. And I also know that you're scared. This is your chance to get out before it's too late." Davenport hesitated again. Then, after a long pause, he sat down across from Clint. "You're right," he said in a low voice, almost whispering. "I've been involved with Holt for too long. But I didn't sign up for this. The things he's done, it's not just about money anymore. He's dangerous. And he's got people on the inside of the courthouse, people I didn't even know he had." Clint's heart raced. This was it. Davenport had just confirmed that Holt had even more influence in the courthouse than Clint had originally thought. "What do you know about the leak?" Clint pressed. "About the documents Williams was sending to Holt." Davenport's face grew pale. "I don't know much. But I know that Williams isn't the only one. There's a network. They've been operating for years, manipulating trials, feeding information. Holt's been pulling strings in places you wouldn't even believe." Clint leaned forward, a sharp edge to his tone. "And who else is involved?" Davenport looked around nervously, then lowered his voice further. "There's someone much bigger than Williams. Someone higher up. Someone who's been helping Holt with his most dangerous deals. I don't know the details, but I know that person is connected to the judges in this city. It's a conspiracy that goes far deeper than you think." Clint's pulse quickened. He had known there were shadows behind the scenes, but this confirmation, it was bigger than he had ever imagined. The entire legal system was compromised, and Holt was the mastermind. Clint sat back in his chair, taking it all in. He had just uncovered a piece of the puzzle that could bring down Holt for good. But with that knowledge came an even greater responsibility. The stakes had just been raised, and Clint knew that the fight was far from over. "Thank you, Davenport," Clint said, his voice calm but filled with resolve. "This won't be easy, but you've done the right thing." Davenport nodded, but there was fear in his eyes. "I hope so. Because if Holt finds out I'm talking to you, I won't make it out alive." Clint didn't respond immediately. His thoughts were already racing ahead. Holt's empire was crumbling, and Clint had the tools to bring it down. But the true challenge was ahead. He wasn't just battling Holt anymore, he was battling a system that had been corrupted from the inside. As Clint left the cafe, his mind was focused on the next steps. There was no turning back now. The storm was coming. The courthouse was buzzing the next day. Word had spread like wildfire about Clint's shocking revelation and the suspension of Williams. People were talking, rumors were flying, and every eye in the building seemed to be watching Clint. But Clint wasn't the type to bask in fleeting moments of glory. The truth he had uncovered was just the beginning. As he entered the courtroom that morning, he could feel the eyes on him, but he kept his gaze fixed on the task at hand. Today was about taking the next step in bringing Holt down. There was still the question of who was truly pulling the strings from behind the scenes, and Clint was determined to find out. He made his way to the defense table, where Sarah was waiting for him. She looked up at him as he sat down, her expression serious. "I've been working on tracking down Davenport's story," she said, her voice low. "I spoke to a few of his old colleagues. They've confirmed he's been in contact with someone on the inside. The thing is, Clint, they're scared. The people we need to talk to are shutting down. They know Holt's got eyes and ears everywhere." Clint leaned in, his face tight with focus. "That's exactly why we need to move fast. Holt's empire isn't just in the courthouse. It's everywhere, across the city, with his influence seeping into every layer of power. But we've got a break now. We can't let that slip away." He glanced up at the judge, who had just entered the room, and noticed a slight hesitation in the judge's step. There was something about him today, something off. His usual air of authority was clouded with an almost imperceptible anxiety. Clint's instincts kicked in. This wasn't just about winning a case anymore. This was about uncovering a network of power that had reached its tendrils into every corner of society. As the trial resumed, Clint stayed focused on the task at hand. He could feel the walls closing in around him, the tension building as Holt's team worked to discredit every piece of evidence he presented. But Clint wasn't going to let them derail his momentum. He had a purpose now, a drive fueled by the need for justice. The court session continued, but Clint's mind was elsewhere. His focus was on the words that Davenport had shared with him. Someone high up. Someone in the judicial system itself. Clint had never been one to take chances, but the stakes had escalated so high that he had no choice but to play this dangerous game. He thought about his conversation with Davenport. A shadow behind the curtain. That's what Davenport had said when asked about the person pulling the strings. Clint wasn't sure who it was, but he had a few ideas. And every possibility led to one name, Judge Trevor Lyons. Clint had known Judge Lyons for years. He was a fixture in the city's legal landscape, a man with a spotless reputation. But Clint had seen the cracks in his perfect facade, moments when Lyons had acted in ways that didn't align with his public persona. The fact that Lyons had presided over some of the most high-profile cases in the city made him an obvious target for scrutiny. "I need to talk to someone who's worked closely with Lyons," Clint told Sarah later that afternoon. "Someone who knows the man behind the robe. We can't afford to miss any detail." Sarah nodded, her fingers already working on her phone. "I'll make some calls." Clint paced back and forth in the small office they had rented for the case, the weight of the investigation pressing on his shoulders. It wasn't just about winning this trial anymore. It was about bringing down a corrupt system. And that meant going after the heart of the machine, Judge Lyons. Hours later, Sarah returned with some unsettling news. I spoke with an old colleague of Lyons. His name's Michael Cartwright. He used to work as a clerk for the judge, but he left a few months ago. Apparently, Lyons hasn't been the same since his involvement in a few controversial decisions. Michael was too scared to go public with what he knew, but he hinted at some shady deals. Clint's mind raced. A few controversial decisions. That didn't sound like Lyons, not the man who had always prided himself on being above reproach. This was a man who had built his career on maintaining the law's integrity. But Clint knew better than to trust appearances. What did Cartwright say about Lyons? Clint asked, leaning in. Sarah hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. Cartwright mentioned that Lyons had been approached by someone who had offered him a deal. The kind of deal that no judge should ever consider. There were rumors of blackmail, money, threats. He wasn't specific, but he did say that Lyons was increasingly paranoid in the months before he left. Clint's heart sank. Blackmail? Threats? This was worse than he had thought. It wasn't just about political maneuvering, it was about manipulation, coercion, and fear. And if Lyons was involved, then he was directly connected to Holt's operations. Clint stood up abruptly. We need to confront Lyons. He's the key to everything. That night, Clint found himself outside Judge Trevor Lyons' mansion. It was a cold evening, and the lights in the windows flickered like a silent warning. Lyons had always been an enigma to Clint, but now, Clint could feel the weight of the man's secrets pressing against him. He wasn't sure what would happen after tonight, but he knew it was time to confront the man who had been at the center of the storm. Sarah stood by his side, her expression determined. We don't know what we'll find in there, Clint. But this is our best shot. Clint nodded, then turned toward the front door. They had planned it carefully, no noise, no alarms. This wasn't a showy confrontation. It was about gathering the facts. The truth had to come from Lyons himself. The door creaked open, and Clint stepped inside, his eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway. The house was too quiet, an eerie silence filled the space, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. As they made their way deeper into the house, Clint's mind raced. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something dangerous. Finally, they reached the study. The door was ajar, and the sound of soft footsteps echoed inside. Lyons was sitting at his desk, his back to the door. But as soon as Clint entered, the judge turned slowly, his face pale, his eyes wide. You shouldn't be here, Clint, Lyons said, his voice trembling. Clint didn't hesitate. It's over, Lyons. You can't hide anymore. I know about the deal. The threats. And I know you're involved with Holt. Lyons' face hardened, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. You don't understand, he whispered. This goes deeper than you know. The atmosphere in Judge Trevor Lyons' study was thick with tension. Clint stood motionless, his eyes locked onto the man who had once been an icon of the legal world. Lyons' face betrayed nothing at first, but his eyes, those eyes, told a different story. They flickered with something deeper. Fear. Regret. And something darker. You don't know what you're getting into, Clint, Lyons murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might trigger some unseen consequence. Clint's jaw clenched. I know enough, he said steadily, his voice cutting through the silence. I know about the blackmail, the threats, the deals you made with Holt. You're tangled in something far beyond what anyone realizes. Lyons turned away from Clint, pacing toward the window. He didn't answer immediately. It was almost as if he was trying to build up the courage to admit the full truth. Clint didn't move, his gaze never leaving the judge. He had seen men crack under pressure before, but Lyons, this man, was something else. He was too proud, too powerful to fall apart easily. Finally, Lyons spoke, his voice low but resigned. It started small. A case here, a favor there. I thought I was doing what was best for the city. But Holt, he has ways of convincing people. He offered me a seat at the table, Clint. A seat of power. And then I got greedy. Clint's mind raced. Holt had promised power to Lyons, and the judge had taken it. It was no surprise, but hearing it from Lyons' mouth made it all the more real. The judge wasn't just a puppet. He had willingly entered the dark side of the game. Did you know what Holt was really doing? Clint asked, his voice even but with an edge that cut through the thick air. The things he's involved in go beyond the courthouse. Beyond anything lawful. It's a network of corruption, and you're part of it. Lyons turned, his eyes now full of regret, but his face remained cold. I didn't know everything. I never wanted this. But Holt promised me influence. He said that together, we could control the city. He said we could change the system. We would be untouchable. Clint took a step forward. And you let him drag you into the mud. You let him use your position as a judge to manipulate the law, all for his own gain. You've betrayed everyone who believes in justice. Lyons flinched at the words, but he didn't deny them. He was already too deep, and he knew it. I never intended for it to go this far. But it did. And now, there's no way out. You don't understand, Clint. I can't go against Holt. He'll ruin me. He'll ruin everything I've built. Clint's eyes narrowed. You've already ruined everything by getting involved with him. The truth is out now, and there's no turning back. You've made your bed, Judge. And now you'll have to lie in it. Lyons' hand gripped the edge of his desk as if the words physically struck him. You think you can stop him? Holt's reach is far too wide. He has people everywhere, inside this very building, in law enforcement, in the city's politics. You're up against something far bigger than you realize. Clint's resolve hardened. I don't care how big it is. If it's wrong, it's wrong. And I'll take it down piece by piece until the whole damn thing crumbles. The judge's face twisted into something almost like a bitter smile. You think you can fight this alone? You've already made enemies. Holt won't let this go. You're walking into a storm, Clint. A storm you can't control. Clint didn't flinch. I've been through worse storms. And I'll keep fighting. As Clint left Lyons' study that night, he felt like the weight of the entire city was bearing down on him. Holt was not just a criminal mastermind, he was a force of nature, using fear and manipulation to twist the very fabric of the justice system. Clint knew now that this wasn't just about exposing Holt's criminal empire. It was about saving a system that was broken beyond recognition. If they didn't act quickly, the entire city's legal foundation could collapse. But Clint wasn't the kind of man who backed down from a challenge. He had already come this far, and there was no turning back. The storm had already started, and Clint had no intention of letting Holt ride out the tide unscathed. That night, Clint sat in the small office he had been using as his headquarters throughout the trial. His mind was spinning. He had the evidence. He had the witnesses. But something about the conversation with Lyons had made one thing clear: Holt was even more dangerous than Clint had anticipated. He rubbed his temples, trying to piece together the puzzle. The more he learned about Holt's connections, the more complicated it became. Holt's reach extended beyond the courthouse, it reached into law enforcement, into local government, into every corner of the city. The web was vast, and it was carefully constructed, designed to remain impenetrable. But Clint had a plan. He had always been one step ahead, and this time wouldn't be any different. The next morning, Clint met with Sarah at the courthouse, his face set in stone. "We need to go public," he said, his voice sharp with determination. "This isn't just about winning this case anymore. It's about exposing Holt for who he truly is. The public needs to know what's going on, or we'll never have a chance to dismantle his empire." Sarah hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. "You're talking about blowing the lid off this whole operation, Clint. If we go public, it'll make us targets. Holt won't just sit back and let us take him down." Clint nodded, understanding the risks. "I know. But we don't have a choice. If we stay quiet, Holt wins. We need to make this public so people can see the truth. It's the only way we can take him down for good." Sarah sighed but nodded. "I'll make the arrangements. We'll need to be careful. Holt has eyes everywhere, and he won't hesitate to strike if he feels cornered." Clint met her gaze, determination burning in his eyes. "Let him try. It's time to take the fight to him." Over the next few days, Clint and Sarah worked in secrecy, preparing to release the evidence to the media. They knew the risks, but Clint had come too far to back down. Holt was a powerful man, but Clint had a weapon of his own, the truth. The plan was set. At the right moment, Clint would release everything, every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every connection between Holt and the corrupt network that spanned the city. It was the only way to expose the full extent of Holt's reach and take him down once and for all. But Clint wasn't naive. He knew that Holt wouldn't let this go without a fight. The battle was just beginning, and it would be a fight unlike any Clint had ever faced. As the day of the reveal approached, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The storm was coming, and it would test everything he had. The day had finally arrived. Clint had spent the last few days preparing for this moment, meticulously going over every detail, every piece of evidence, every witness statement. He had crossed every T and dotted every I, but deep down, he knew the true test was still ahead. Holt would not go down quietly. And neither would his network of loyal followers. Clint stood outside the courthouse that morning, the cold air biting at his skin, but it felt like a relief after the suffocating pressure of the past few days. Inside, the courtroom was buzzing with anticipation, reporters gathering, officials murmuring, and attorneys exchanging wary glances. Word had spread about Clint's upcoming move, and the tension was palpable. Everyone knew something big was about to happen, but no one knew exactly what. Clint's eyes scanned the building. He could almost feel the weight of the world on his shoulders, the eyes of the city, of the entire justice system, fixed upon him. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a battle for the very soul of the legal system, a fight to cleanse it from the corruption that had festered for far too long. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from Sarah. It's set. Everything's in place. We go live in 10 minutes. Clint felt a surge of adrenaline. It was happening. He stepped inside the courthouse and made his way through the halls. As he passed by, he noticed the looks, the judgment, the curiosity. Some looked at him with admiration, others with disdain. But Clint wasn't paying attention to them anymore. He had a mission. When Clint entered the courtroom, the murmur of conversation died down immediately. The judge took his seat, his face grim but composed. The prosecution team was already in position, their faces set in professional masks, as though they knew today would be anything but ordinary. Clint made his way to the defense table, where Sarah was already seated, her expression intense. She gave him a brief nod as he sat down next to her. There was no time for small talk. The moment had come. Clint stood, the room falling silent as everyone waited for his next move. He walked to the front of the courtroom, facing the judge and the gallery. His gaze swept over the room, making eye contact with several key figures, those who were already questioning what had been happening under their noses. They knew, as Clint did, that this wasn't just about Holt. This was about the corruption that had infiltrated the very heart of the justice system. "Your Honor," Clint began, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of a man who had uncovered a dark truth, "today I'm not just here to defend my client. I'm here to expose a system that has been hijacked by a man whose greed and manipulation have tainted everything it touches. Today, we will reveal the truth, the full extent of the web Holt has spun throughout this city and the courthouse." There was a collective gasp from the gallery. People shifted uneasily in their seats. Even the judge's expression faltered for a split second. But Clint wasn't finished. "I've been given the opportunity to present evidence that has been painstakingly gathered over weeks of investigation, evidence that links Holt to a series of corrupt deals involving judges, law enforcement officials, and powerful figures in local government," Clint continued, his voice unwavering. He turned and gestured to a projector that had been set up in the corner of the courtroom. With a click, the screen flashed to life, displaying a series of documents, emails, and photos, evidence of bribes, payoffs, and shady deals that Holt had orchestrated. The room was dead silent as the visuals unfolded before them. Holt's defense attorney stood up, attempting to interject, but Clint raised a hand, silencing him. "If I may, Your Honor," Clint said, turning his attention back to the judge, "I would like to continue my presentation. The truth is too important to ignore." The judge hesitated, then nodded, allowing Clint to proceed. Clint clicked through the slides, each one more damning than the last. He showed the email correspondence between Holt and Judge Lyons, the covert meetings with law enforcement officers, and the accounts of witnesses who had been intimidated or silenced by Holt's operatives. As the evidence piled up, the faces in the room shifted from curiosity to disbelief. People shifted uneasily in their seats. Whispers rippled through the gallery. But then came the moment Clint had been waiting for, the final piece of the puzzle. With a click of the button, the screen displayed a series of photos showing Holt and Judge Lyons together at a private event, shaking hands with local officials. But there was one person in the background, hidden in the shadows of the photo, just barely visible. It was someone Clint had only just discovered in his investigation, the city's chief of police, Michael Thompson. The room gasped as Clint's words filled the air. And here we have the last piece of the puzzle. Holt didn't just have influence in the legal world. He had ties to the police force, too. Michael Thompson, the very man tasked with upholding the law, was working with Holt all along. Gasps of shock and outrage erupted from the gallery. The prosecutor, who had been sitting quietly, now stood, her face pale. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," she protested. But Clint wasn't deterred. "The people of this city deserve to know the truth. We cannot let this corruption continue. It is time to bring it all to light." He turned to the judge, who was now visibly shaken, his face pale. Clint didn't wait for the judge's response. He knew this was it, the moment of reckoning. For the next few moments, the courtroom was filled with an uncomfortable silence, as everyone tried to process what they had just seen. The judge's gavel struck, signaling the court's recess, and the chaos erupted. The defense team scrambled to assess the damage. Holt's supporters, who had been sitting confidently only moments before, were now scrambling, their faces showing signs of panic. Even the prosecutor seemed lost for words. But Clint didn't feel like a victor. He wasn't done yet. Holt was still a threat. Lyons, Thompson, none of them had been taken down completely. There was still work to do. As Clint made his way out of the courtroom, he could feel Sarah beside him. "That was incredible," she whispered, her eyes wide. "You just changed everything." Clint didn't smile. He didn't feel like celebrating. It's not over yet. Holt still has too many allies, too many resources. This fight is far from over. The aftermath of Clint's bold revelation rippled through the city like a shockwave. News outlets were in a frenzy, headlines splashed across every newspaper, and social media exploded with the truth: Holt's corruption, his network of deceit, his manipulation of the entire legal system, it was all out in the open. But Clint wasn't basking in the glory of his victory. Not yet. The real challenge was just beginning. After the courtroom drama, Clint returned to his makeshift office, the one place where he could still think clearly amidst the chaos. He sat in silence for a moment, replaying every detail in his mind. The photos of Holt with the police chief, the judge's involvement, the damning emails, it was all there. But Clint knew that Holt would stop at nothing to protect himself. Holt had too much power, and power, as Clint had learned, was not something easily dismantled. He glanced at the clock. Time was running out. Holt would retaliate soon, he always did. And Clint needed to act fast. The door to his office creaked open, and Sarah stepped inside, her face grim. She closed the door behind her, locking it to ensure no one overheard. "Clint," she said, her voice low, "we've got a problem." Clint raised an eyebrow, already anticipating bad news. "What is it?" "Holt's not just sitting back," Sarah continued. "We've learned that he's been contacting several key figures, trying to gather his forces. He's planning something. And we're not sure what it is yet, but it's big." Clint stood up, his pulse quickening. This was exactly what he had been waiting for. Holt wasn't going to go down without a fight. He never did. "We need to act fast," Clint said, his voice sharp with urgency. "We can't let him turn the tables on us. Do we have any way to track where he's going, who he's meeting?" Sarah hesitated, then pulled out her phone. "There's a meeting scheduled for tonight. Holt and a few of his allies are getting together at a private location. It's all hush-hush, but we've got the intel. If we move now, we can catch him." Clint's eyes narrowed. This was it. The final confrontation. Then we're going after him. The night air was thick with tension as Clint and Sarah made their way to the secret location. The streets were eerily quiet, and every corner felt like it was hiding something more dangerous than they could imagine. Clint had been in more than his share of tight situations, but something about this felt different. Holt wasn't just a criminal, he was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. And Clint couldn't let him escape. They arrived at the building, a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of town. Clint knew better than to underestimate what might be inside. Holt was smart. He would have security. He would have people ready to fight for him. But Clint was ready. They moved swiftly, taking cover behind a stack of crates as they scoped out the area. Clint's mind raced with possibilities. Would Holt be there? Would he try to escape before Clint could make his move? Sarah tapped Clint's shoulder, pointing toward a small door at the side of the building. "There," she whispered. "That's where they're meeting. We can get inside without being seen." Clint nodded, his instincts sharp. They slipped past the guards, using the shadows to their advantage, and found themselves in a dimly lit hallway. Clint's heart pounded in his chest. This was the moment. They reached the door, and Clint carefully turned the handle, pushing it open just enough to peek inside. There, at the center of the room, stood Holt. His back was to them, but Clint could see the smug expression on his face as he spoke to a group of men. They were all wearing expensive suits, people who were more than just ordinary criminals. These were the players at the top of the food chain. But what Clint didn't expect was the presence of Judge Lyons, standing at Holt's side, his face grim but determined. The judge looked different now, haggard, tired. Clint knew that Lyons had no choice but to stick with Holt. He had already sold his soul. As the conversation grew more heated, Clint knew he couldn't wait any longer. He pushed open the door with a force that made it creak loudly, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Holt turned sharply, his eyes narrowing as he saw Clint and Sarah standing in the doorway. For a split second, Clint saw a flicker of fear cross Holt's face, but it was quickly masked by the cold arrogance Clint had come to expect. "Clint," Holt sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "I should have known you'd be stupid enough to come here." You've exposed me for what I am, but you think that's enough to take me down. You think you've won. Clint stepped forward, his presence commanding. You've been playing this game for far too long, Holt. You've manipulated everyone, judges, police, politicians, all to serve your needs. But now it's over. Your empire is crumbling. Holt's expression darkened. You think this is over? You've exposed a few pieces of my operation, but that's just the beginning. The real power doesn't lie in the courts or the law, it lies in the streets, in the underground. And you'll never defeat that, Clint. Clint didn't flinch. I've never been afraid of your kind, Holt. Your empire of fear and lies ends tonight. You're going down. Lyons, standing behind Holt, spoke up, his voice shaky. Clint, you don't understand. We had no choice. We were being controlled. Holt has more power than you can imagine. There's no way out now. If you bring him down, you'll bring everything down with him. Clint's eyes burned with resolve. Then it's a price worth paying. The system has to be rebuilt. You've been part of the problem, Lyons. And now you're going to be part of the solution, by testifying and putting Holt away for good. Holt's laugh echoed through the room. You think I'll just let that happen? You think you've won? You've made your move, Clint, but I always have a way out. As if on cue, Holt's men reached for their weapons. But Clint was faster. In a blur of motion, Clint disarmed the closest man and used his momentum to knock him out cold. The rest of the room erupted in chaos as Clint and Sarah fought back, using every ounce of training they had to subdue Holt's men. After what seemed like an eternity, Clint and Sarah stood over the defeated figures of Holt's associates. Holt himself was backed into a corner, his face contorted in fury. But even with the odds against him, Clint remained calm, steady. You're done, Holt, Clint said, his voice cold. As police sirens blared in the distance, Clint knew that this was the end. Holt's empire was finished, and the corrupt officials who had supported him would soon face justice. But Clint didn't feel like celebrating. He had won, yes, but the battle had taken everything out of him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Clint felt a sense of peace. He had done what he set out to do. He had brought justice to the broken system, even if it had cost him more than he cared to admit. As the police arrived to take Holt away, Clint looked at Sarah, a small smile on his face. It's over, Clint said. Is it, though? Sarah asked, her voice thoughtful. Clint nodded slowly. For now. But the fight for justice never truly ends. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?